So good morning, everyone. We're thrilled to have you for the financial leadership and management training for smaller organizations, organizations with budget sizes of $750,000 annually or less. We are also thrilled to have, this is sponsored by WSCDV, the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and WCSAP, the Washington Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs. We're really thrilled to have, and very lucky to have Kay Soul today. Kay is the, she has been with domestic violence programs in our state for over 25 years and has played a really significant role in the steadiness, the stability, the flexibility that we have in our state for domestic violence programs, and this question of how do we have funding serve our missions and serve the purpose of survivor for freedom and liberation, rather than the other way around, having the money drive that. So we're very, very fortunate to have Kay with us today, and then we'll have another session tomorrow for larger organizations. Kay has had an incredible, stellar career for over 25 years working with small and large nonprofits that are mission-driven. And, you know, really around this question of how can we as advocates be in charge of the money rather than have the money be in charge of us. So that's part of what we're doing today, is getting on the balcony, kind of taking a step away from the crises of the moment, because there's always a crisis, even though this is a pretty big one, but it's taking a step away from that to really see how we can grow our skills and not be intimidated by this mysterious topic. So anything else you want to say about yourself, Kay?
No, other than I told Judy before we started that Judy knows I have been involved actually since 1975 in Oregon and 1981 in Washington, which is probably truly before many current workers in the field were born. But when I saw this slide this morning with the Forging a Path to Flexibility session, and remembered how in those early days, those of us working in domestic violence, we knew that actually financial assistance to help survivors get started again, and that they would make very good decisions, but we could not see a path to providing that. And so for those of you who have stuck in this movement, I just have to say it truly warms my heart to see that that is now a reality, and it's really all of your work that you have gotten that to happen. So I'm very excited about that. And then I'm also very excited about what we're going to talk about today. And actually the place where I thought we should start is rather an odd slide, but you know, I've been thinking about all of you and also all of the other people in the nonprofits I work with across the country, particularly the executive directors, that this is just a time of incredible challenge, incredible uncertainty, incredible anxiety, incredible worry, not just about the survivors, but about our staff and our volunteers. And I think that's pretty easy to feel completely overwhelmed by what is going on. And so my hope for this workshop that we're going to have online today is that you can take a break. Take an hour and a bit break from all of what is weighing on you and just bliss out for about 75 minutes. And, you know, that may seem odd since our topic is finances, and some people don't associate budgeting and financial management with bliss. But my goal is that everybody with us today will find a moment of bliss as they sort of think about something else other than the immediate crisis, and hopefully find something, some idea that comes through your mind about how you might look at your finances that really gives you a moment of inspiration. And we've got a plan for how we're going to work through this, but I just kind of invite you to keep that second picture in mind as we go. Okay, so now we're going to get going, and here's the overall plan for the day. And you remember when we thought we were all going to be together in Yakima that we were going to spend a whole day together. Well, I found you just really can't spend a whole day online staring at your computer screen. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to have this session that will end by 11. I hope you will give yourself the time between 11 and 1:30 to really work on some questions that I've prepared for you. What I find, I go to workshops, it's all really interesting, a lot of ideas cross my mind, and then I come back to my desk and it all goes out of my mind immediately. And so this is a chance to really think about whether any of these ideas could work for your organization. And I know most of you are probably not sitting in the same office with a coworker. If you are, that would be great, particularly if our teams could be the executive director and the fiscal person and a program person. But if you're not together, I hope you have figured out your own Zoom or FaceTime or whatever you're using to communicate, and that you will take at least a part of our break time to try answering the questions and discussing the topics. And one incentive for doing that is, you'll see when you look at that handout, that there is a chance to request follow-up. And so if you all can agree on what follow-up you would like, that would help. We're going to come back together at 1:30 and do the second half of this session, and that's going to end at 3. And there are more exercises. Now, I understand that by 3 o'clock, by 4:30, your bliss may be over and you may feel like you need to look at your email. But I hope you will take another moment. And again, if you experience that bliss, this could be something to do on a break tomorrow. So you can follow up with email questions to me. You see my website address down there at the bottom of the slides. My email is just k@KSOL Consulting, and I welcome that, and I will answer them. And part of what Judy and I have been talking about is, if I get the same question from multiple people, we'll share answers with everyone. And there's also a chance for online consultation. So with all that explanation, that's more about these participant exercises. That's the discussion period after each half of the session. Let's get on to what we're going to talk about this morning. And thank all of you who,
Okay, one more thing I just wanted to say is we welcome everyone who's here today. We've got domestic violence sheltering programs. I think we have some standalone, culturally specific by and for programs, sexual assault programs, dual programs, tri programs, and then also one of the DSHS contract managers. And, if at any point, and Maureen, thank you so much for being here, because it's really valuable to have your participation. But at any point, folks, just like any training that WSCDIV does, if you prefer that we have some time that's just for DV and SA program folks, I can reach out to Maureen. But we really want to make this a comfortable place for all of you. So just let us know how we can make that happen. Thanks. Thanks, Kay.
Great. All right. Well, so what are we doing this morning? Well, first of all, thank you to everyone who filled out the survey, because that's extremely helpful. And there were differences between larger and smaller programs. And I have tried to respond to what the smaller organizations said they were most interested in. So what we're going to start on first is organization-wide budget challenges. And there are many. We're going to be talking particularly about cost-centered budgets. And what I find is that this is often a concept that people are very familiar with. They just call it by different names. So we're going to try to get our language clear enough that we can know what we're talking about. And then the final piece this morning will be about cost allocation. And we'll go into why that is such an important topic in relation to doing your organization-wide budget. Now, this afternoon, we're going to start with a focus on federal funds requirements. And you may be sitting there thinking, but oh, if only we had any direct federal funds. We don't have any relationships with federal agencies directly. But of course, what we all know is, if the money you are receiving from the state or from local government or from another nonprofit, if it is federal in origin, those federal cooties are coming right with it, and it's going to bring the federal funds management requirements. And some of you know, and I know we've been together after we had the big changes in those rules back in 2014, 15, but I hope you're all following that even in the midst of this virus crisis, OMB yesterday closed the comment period on proposed big changes to those federal rules. So we'll talk just a little bit about that because we don't really know what they're going to do with the comments that they received. Then that compliance section will be fairly short because we want to have enough time to really talk about financial information for boards and for executive directors and for people who are actually doing the program work. And so this is an area where people have very different opinions. I'll share mine, but it might be provocative enough that it will get you talking about what you think about it. And finally, I know that since not all of you are able to bliss out with accounting requirements on an everyday basis, I thought it might be helpful to share a little bit about what's been happening in the accounting profession, which actually has finally started focusing on nonprofits. We used to be of no interest to anyone, and suddenly there's a lot of interest in trying to help us make our financial information more understandable to readers of our financial reports. Of course, the accounting profession's view of what is more understandable might not be your view, but for those of you who are audited or have reviews, you're going to be dealing with these new requirements, so I think we might as well talk about them. Okay, so I want to get started by talking about the challenges of trying to do organization-wide budgeting. And, I started my career in nonprofits, actually in domestic violence, with a typical startup organization. And when we put a budget together, it was a one-column budget, and it was just a list of the sources we thought we were going to get money from and a list of the expenses that we planned to have for the year, things like salaries, taxes. We didn't have benefits, but if we had, we would have put them there, supplies, and other costs. And that was adequate for us at the beginning. But as we grew and we started having multiple programs and multiple funding agreements, it really wasn't that helpful. And so we went through a period where we had, when we said, let's look at the annual budget, people would bring out sort of stacks of papers or file folders, or now we would say, computer files, where we'd have, well, here's the budget for this agreement with the state, and here's the budget for this agreement with a foundation. And we would have all these separate budgets by funding source. And we would eventually sort of smush it all together back into that single column. But really, there was usually only one person in the organization who had any understanding of how those pieces fit together. And that understanding was in their head. It wasn't on a spreadsheet. It wasn't on anything that people could see. So I think the nonprofit world, and certainly I have come a long way from that point. And so what I want to talk about today is formats to actually integrate all that information about all the different programs that you are doing and also the different funding agreements that you have. And then I want us to use that to think a little bit about some of the restrictions that come with some of those funding agreements and to see if there are ways to figure out how we can be more flexible so that we end up having money to spend on the things that are most important to accomplishing our goals without violating any funding agreements. But what I'm hoping for is that these are some strategies that help us back away from thinking about things in silos. Well, I got this money from VOCA and it's only for this purpose. It was competitive. I got it for this purpose. And I have this money for this other purpose and this money for this other purpose. You do have to follow the rules. And I'm not saying anything about, just forget those agreements and spend the money on whatever you want. I am talking about some techniques that might help you do more comprehensive thinking and find greater flexibility in how to use all those different funding streams. So that's a goal for today. And the other thing that I know from my work with many nonprofits is that for almost all of us, personnel costs are going to be the largest single type of expense. And I know that in Washington, in domestic violence, in sexual assault, with the VOCA money, there has been a great deal of interest in trying to improve compensation for our staff, which is an incredibly important goal. And that just puts more weight behind if we're going to start talking about using budgeting to have a more powerful approach to how we manage our money. We've got to start by talking about personnel. But before I go into a little bit more on that, I just also want to acknowledge that this idea of budgeting for a whole organization for a year and having multiple programs, like many of us have both domestic violence and sexual assault, and we have other programs. We may have some children's programming. We have other programs besides those main categories. So we're dealing with multiple programs, and most of you, from looking at the survey, have multiple funding agreements that are supporting you. So that's great, but I could also see that many of you have category that I would call uncertain. That is, you're going to raise money through events, through donor letters, through email campaigns, and there are no guarantees on what that is going to raise, and yet you've got to include that in your annual budget. And the other thing, just to preview where we're going, is that to make all of this work and to make it stand up to monitoring and auditing and all those other things, we're going to have to talk about how we allocate costs that benefit more than one program. What am I talking about there? Well, something as simple as you have the internet for all of your programs and activities, and you probably get one bill from your internet service provider, and cost allocation is how you're going to determine how that bill should end up getting divided up among your programs and among your funding sources. But with that, I want to come back to talking about beginning at the beginning with personnel costs. And hopefully everyone, as you begin the preparation of your annual budget, starts by preparing the personnel schedule. And, this is a list of every position you have and whether they're working full-time or part-time and whether they work all 12 months or part of the year, what their salary or wage rate is, and the fringe benefits that are associated with their positions. Now, throughout the workshop today, I'm going to be talking about some complex financial information that needs to be integrated in a way that everyone can understand it. And I included this slide, which you may have to blow up big on your screen, that is a sample personnel schedule, and it just illustrates that you're going to start with your full-time people and then go down to your part-time positions, and you're going to lay out what you're expecting their base salary to be. And then what's really going to be useful is that see if I can make my pointer work, that you're going to divide it up into which programs each of those positions is going to be working in. Now, in a moment, we're going to get into the fact that some of you would probably say, no, I don't divide it up by program. I divide it up by funding award. That's our system. And we're going to come back to that in a minute. But for the moment, I am hoping that you might find, let's see if I can turn my slide, this link useful, because we are going to be talking about needing to do detailed analysis of funding agreements, complex analysis of programs that are supported by multiple funding sources, as well as by some of that uncertain donor income. And this is a fabulous template. It's a linked Excel spreadsheet template. Now, if you are an Excel expert, you have probably already done this through setting up the different tabs for the different grants and the different programs and the different funding years, and you've made it all linked together into a beautiful final summary page. But I am not an Excel expert, and I love this because it has given me the power to organize information in a really clear way. And I'm going to come back and talk about that a little bit more in a moment, but that's a link to it, and you can download it, and it's free. So now we're ready to really get into the issue of the organization-wide budget using the concept of cost center. And I want to, you know, sometimes you just don't know what somebody is talking about, basically, when they say cost centers and a cost-centered budget. So I want to illustrate here that in a cost-centered budget, you're going to have rows for all the different kinds of expenses: personnel, salaries, taxes, benefits, all that stuff. And also income. I'm just showing expense here to make it a little simpler. Yours is going to be, of course, much more detailed than this, but I hope it's not going to be overly detailed, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So we start with the rows of the cost categories and the income categories, and then we start in the functional version of cost centers. We start asking the question, okay, I'm going to hire some positions. Why? What are they supposed to be doing? And some of them are going to be doing management. Some of them are going to be doing fundraising. Some are going to be doing advocacy. And maybe we have an emergency shelter, and maybe we have a children's program, and maybe we have a sexual assault program. Your spreadsheet is probably going to go a lot further across the page. Now, you'll notice in my talking about these programs or functions, I am not at this point talking about my funding agreements. I'm actually talking about what we do. So if I have a children's program, I might have 3 different funding agreements that are going to pay for that. But what's going to be in here is the cost of doing the children's program. Now, that is a contrast to this version of a cost center budget, which is a funding agreement version. And in this version, starts out the same way: line items for all the cost categories and also for the income categories. But the distribution, the categorization, or the cost center structure is by funding source agreement. And I have a column for my unrestricted, that various fundraising event and solicitations of all kinds, anything that doesn't come through a formal agreement. And Judy has a question.
Hey, Kay, so could you say again, so you're saying that that organizations, it would be planful to have both this, which says, okay, how are we've got a DSHS contract, an OCVA contract, a DSHS VOCA contract, United Way grant, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so this is tracking, okay, here's what this contract, each one of these columns is for a different contract.
Right.
But then in addition, you're saying, the previous slide you had, you're saying, okay, this is how we plan for, okay, all the United Way money. Well, the United Way money is going across. So,
right, exactly.
So
this is
some
how
of it
we
goes
plan
into,
for
yeah.
our different programs or projects. And of course, what we really need is a third piece that integrates these 2 ideas, right? Because ultimately what we want to know is, well, what are the programs that our organization is going to operate? That's how we're going to talk to our board about it. That's how we're going to talk to the community about it. That's really going to be meaningful, much more meaningful to people who want to understand what we're doing than if I give them a list of, well, there's this contract and that contract and the other contract, and well, some of these contracts pay for multiple programs. That's inside baseball. That is very important inside our organization. it really does not help boards understand what is it we're going to do and where is it that we are getting the money to do it with, and which of our services do we just not have enough of this more certain money, these awards, and we're going to have to use our uncertain money, our community fundraising, to fill in the gaps on those programs. So that's, I'm going to take us to what I hope will help us build an understanding of this, and then we're going to look at how can we get the best of both worlds. So this is a sample functional budget, and remember, functional is when we're talking about cost centers being defined by purpose. So I have an administrative purpose, a fundraising purpose, a program A, program B, program C. But here in program C is an illustration of the challenge that we're talking about. Because if you'll notice down below where I've put the income categories, I've put income associated with program A and program B and program C. I've put it in the right column. But the truth is that, and that would be fine if what I had was some foundation money where they said, yeah, we want to support your children's program at the shelter, and so here's money to support that program. And no, we're not really interested in restricting it line item by line item. We just want to be sure you spend it on the children's program. This would be adequate for that. But here's an example of another type of agreement that we might have where the funder is saying, yeah, it's for program C, it's definitely for program C, but when you are reporting to us, you're going to have to report to us on every single line item. We've established a budget for every single line item, and if you want to vary from that budget beyond a certain percentage, you're going to have to get permission to do it. And so this is a situation in which it's when I want to understand program C, I'm going to have to combine these two columns, right, to understand the whole thing of program C, that some of what I have in program C I'm going to be paying for with a collection of different sources, but some of what I have in program C I'm going to be paying for with one, or in reality probably several, very specific award agreements where I have very detailed line item requirements. Now, one of the problems with looking at things in 2 dimensions is it doesn't really illustrate a 3-dimensional situation. And the 3-dimensional situation behind this is that for every one of these programs, we probably have multiple award budgets that are feeding in there. And so what we want is a tool that is going to integrate those multiple funding awards into their programmatic purpose so we can think about it in terms of what is the program purpose. And the reason why I think that's so important is that it's the program purpose that has to do with meeting the needs of people. It's not some grant agreement or another grant agreement. It's really, what is our program for children? What is our program for rural victims of sexual assault? And we're going to have to combine multiple resources to get there. Now, one thing, I'm never sure how good this looks on somebody's computer. Hopefully you can blow it up if it's hard to see. One of the things that I'm illustrating here as a benefit of using this functional budgeting style is, you know, I figured out the cost of each of our programs. And we're going to talk about this line in a moment, that I had to allocate out the administrative cost to get to the full cost of each program. And down here, I put income into the programmatic categories, including this big grant, Program C, Grant 1. And then I subtracted and I said, well, how close am I coming in Program A to covering all the costs of Program A with these awards and foundation grants that are for that program? And what I could see was, well, I didn't quite cover it all. I was short. I fell short of being able to cover the cost of Program A. I also fell short of being able to cover the cost of Program B. And so what am I going to do about that? I didn't fall short over here in grant 1 because it's a grant, and of course, income is going to equal expense in that grant budget. So what am I going to do about these shortfalls in the other programs? Well, fortunately, we got a big fundraising program going on, and I'm going to look at all the income I'm able to generate that isn't tied to a specific requirement for doing this program or that program or the other. And I'm going to be able to, I have to, you know, it costs money to raise money, so I have to subtract out. And I realized that, well, you know, this organization is going to do really well. They are going to generate a surplus from their fundraising. And what I'm illustrating here is how we're going to use that net income from fundraising. And the biggest chunk of it is going to go actually to underwrite the cost of program C, some's going to go to underwrite program B, and some to program A. And, you know, this sample is actually fairly typical. What has happened with programs like Grant 1, where initially they're paying 100% of the cost of doing something, and over time they no longer cover the full cost, and we have to carry a bigger and bigger burden, or the match requirement increases. This is something you're able to do in the functional structure, but only if you have behind it a real understanding of your grant funding. And so it really does mean, let me get the little dot out of the way, it really does mean that in order to build that functional budget, behind it, I have to have a grant award worksheet that parallels my budget. Now, some of us, I saw in the survey, some of us are really lucky in this group that we may be running on a July through June fiscal year, and most of our funding agreements are also July through June, 1 year at a time. So the current year portion of that kind of agreement would be all the agreement is. It would be the same thing as the total award or contract. You know, here's the total award or contract. It's from July through June. Great. And that's the current portion. But that's not true of all the money that we're getting. For one thing, some of us are getting funds that are on the federal fiscal year. That's October through September. And so we may look at a total award budget that's in an agreement, and we may realize, well, I got to break that into segments because a portion of that is already going to be used up. It's going to be in the prior year before I ever get to the current year portion. And for some of us, it may be that we're starting our budgeting for a July through June year, but we're budgeting in income that is actually from an old fiscal, federal fiscal year grant, and there's going to be a portion of it that extends out beyond our year. So where I'm going with all this is to say that if you want to organize your annual budget information by function so that you, your board, your foundation donors, your community can understand what's being invested in each of your programs and how much you're investing in agency-wide management and in fundraising, behind that model, you're going to have done analysis of each of your awards so that you know that you've got the correct portion of the award feeding into the correct function. Now, I'm going to take it a little further and say that a variation on what I was just talking about is awards that have a match requirement, that we need to do the underlying work for that program, that is the total program budget. Here's the governmental award, and they've got a match requirement, so we're going to have to show what we're spending the match on. And it may be true, it seems to be true for many of my clients, that even after we meet the match requirement, there are still other costs that we have to cover in some other way because it's just not enough to fund that whole program. And of course, we know that the big issue with match requirements is that we can't use the same match I'm going to match program A, and then I'm going to match program B, and then I'm going to match program C with the same dollar. So we're going to have a structure that lets us show that we are not counting the match twice. So again, this is like underlying behind a program budget. Yeah, Judy.
I just want to say we are advocating right now at the federal level with members of Congress and our senators for the COVID-19 relief package. And one of the things that we're advocating for, along with additional funds for domestic violence and sexual assault, is to eliminate the match requirement, not just at this time, but ongoing. So if you have time today during your lunch break, please reach out to your congressperson and to Senator Murray and Senator Cantwell and say, you know, please pass this and get rid of this match requirement that, you know, none of us
It's
can
such
track
an
match right
important
now.
thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's just going to be, that's the last thing that we need to be doing. So today is the
It,
day.
it
We're
really
voting on it
isn't.
today.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, Judy, because it's so important. Because I think, and we're going to be doing a webinar on this in a couple of weeks, but I think that part of what is going to happen in our virus crisis is some of us are going to have more difficulty raising that uncertain money. And all of us are probably going to have some additional costs. And if we're locked in to having to use whatever unrestricted money we're able to generate, if we're locked in to tying it into match for this, it is really going to make it even more difficult. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. That's a great thing to advocate for.
Okay, and
I
that was
want
a
to keep going.
non-DSHS moment.
Right. Now, I hope it's obvious to everybody already. I didn't say it explicitly, but whichever structure for your annual budget you choose to use, whichever cost center structure you establish, it really has to parallel the structure that you're going to use in your accounting system and reporting system. The worst thing on earth is to have developed a detailed cost-centered budget for budget purposes and then have the accounting system handling the tracking of these restricted grants and handling the tracking of program costs and fundraising costs and management costs differently. Then you really do not have the ability to ask and answer the question, is our plan working, by comparing your budget to what actually happened. And sometimes I'm with organizations where they've gone out of sync, and so I see somebody doing a lot of extra spreadsheet work to figure out how to compare what's in the accounting system to what's in the budget. That really isn't necessary. And so if at the end of this discussion today, you find yourself thinking, well, you know, I think we really could get further with a different approach to budgeting. I just hope you will remember you are not alone. You have got to talk about that with whoever is doing the accounting for your agency, because you're going to want to change both things at the same time and not have them go out of sync. And that just brings us back to this sort of central question about cost center structure. We saw the functional structure. That was the one that went management, fundraising, program A, program B, program C. We saw the funding source structure. That was the one that went award 1, award 2, award 3. What we probably really want is a structure that combines the two, that is organized by function, but provides an underlying structure to integrate the funding sources. And so if you're going to try to do that type of budgeting, what it's going to mean is you start by sorting each kind of cost, like your personnel cost, by function. How much of this person's time is going to be spent in agency-wide management, how much in fundraising, how much in program A, program B, program C, and then you go through and you sort again by funding source. Now, I've got I know we have accountants on this call. I'm gonna come to you in a minute, Judy. And the accountants are probably saying, hey, I got that taken care of in my accounting system because we use account code segments. And we are able to say, well, what's the line item? Is it supplies? Okay, great, that's the line item. I've got a segment for that. And what's the programmatic or functional purpose? Oh, those are supplies for the children's program. I've got a code segment for that. Oh, and who's paying for it? Which funding source? Okay, it's award 1. So I've handled that in my accounting system. And if you have that kind of accounting system, and I'll just pause here and say, if you have a sophisticated fund accounting system like MIP, you have account segments for that. But as smaller organizations, a lot of us use QuickBooks. And so what we're talking about is line items, right? That's where we put supplies and telephone and that, okay? And then we use classes for the programmatic functional purpose, and we use customer jobs for the funding source. And some of us flip that and say, no, I use classes for funding sources and I use customer job for program. Whichever way you do it, you've got 3 different categorizations. And so what we want to do is find a way in the budget to parallel those 3 categorizations. Yeah.
Anne says it's a lot, but it's coming together.
Okay, but that's what we want. It is a lot. And if you're looking at this and you're thinking, I would love to do that, but I just can't, it just seems like I would have a million spreadsheets flying around and I couldn't do it. That's why I suggested that template, because they've got it so that you start at the beginning with what's our personnel plan, and then they have you go through what are all our funding awards, what are they saying, and then they have you organize it into programs, and then they produce the master budget in the template.
Great.
Well, I think we should keep going, and
Yep.
I'm
Dave
glad you
and
stopped
Karen
me.
say thumbs up. Okay, here we go.
Okay,
Great.
great. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, so yeah, thank you. Now I'm gonna have a little debate with myself about the merit of functional versus funding source. And on the pro side of the functional structure, if you've looked at your 990 or you look at your audited statements that follow GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles, this is it. This is golden. They want you to present things in terms of management, fundraising, and although it says program, it's actually your different programs. So that's, the world is thinking functional. And so the big pro of using this functional cost center as your primary presentation format is that it actually, and we're going to talk more about this in just a minute, it makes it more possible to determine and then present the full cost of a program, of an actual service, that someone can understand what the service is, as opposed to some grant agreement and then another grant agreement. So makes it possible to know the full cost of providing specific services, even when you are meeting that cost with multiple funding agreements. And why I think that's so worthwhile is that it often turns out that when you step back from this grant by grant thinking and look at the cost of delivering a service, you discover that there are actual gaps between what you are able to get from all your different grant awards and what it fully costs to do that service. And that can focus your attention for either changing the budgets in some of those funding agreements if you can, or what you're going to do with your privately raised unrestricted money. I do believe this makes it clearer to readers like your board and your donors and your community what this organization is doing, rather than it's a compendium of a bunch of government awards. And I think it encourages and supports kind of holistic thinking, stepping back from those awards. What is it that survivors need in our area? What is it that our community needs? And it doesn't get focused on what I call the slice and dice, which is, I'm going to pay for 10 cents of this cost out of that agreement and $20 out of that agreement. It is challenging. And one of the reasons it's challenging is that it doesn't allow you to let go of those funding source agreements, and they have required line items that you're going to have to track and report on. So it's not like you can just say, well, I'm done with funding source agreements. You've got to integrate them. Now, I've kind of alluded to this idea of the full cost of services, which I think is a really important idea. And the concept is that you would say, okay, I've got these different programs. You might have 6 different programs. And you're going to have some shared expenses, like your telephone system, like your internet system, like your website. Like if you're in one facility, whatever rent you're paying on the facility, you're going to have some shared expenses, and you're going to have some agency-wide administrative expenses. And if you want to know what the full cost of doing a service is, you're going to have to combine the costs that are directly associated with Program A with a share of those common costs like the phone system and the internet, and a share of the administrative expenses. Now, another way of looking at this is like this. If you want to understand the program net income, you're going to look at, well, what is the income that I was able to get in Program A from my different funding sources, and in Program B and in Program C? What were the direct costs of doing that? What I had to pay people to do those services. I had to pay for their travel to do the services. What are the direct costs? This is accountant speak to say if you subtract the direct expenses from the income, you get the gross margin. Don't worry too much about that. Here's the allocated expenses, because we didn't just do this program with the people directly working in it. They needed to be paid, so we had an accountant and we did payroll. We needed to have a board providing oversight, so we had administrative costs. So I allocate those out, and it's then that I can see the net income. And if you think back to our example earlier, in some of our programs, it's not going to be net income, it's going to be net loss, because we don't have income sufficient to pay the full cost. So that is a kind of the end of my commercial message about why I think that the functional approach may be very helpful. Now, I know that many domestic violence and sexual assault programs, because they are juggling multiple funding agreements, have chosen the funding source cost center structure. And in that structure, you treat your cost center as equivalent to each funding agreement, and you are very focused on, well, what will this agreement pay for and what will that agreement pay for? And so then you have to deal with the fact that either you've got a match requirement to meet, or you just need unrestricted money that you're going to fundraise for, and you're going to have to create a cost center for that. And so that's how you get to this type of funding source cost center format. And, you know, kind of look at the pros and cons on that. I think people will say, well, the biggest pro is that I'm honed in on producing information that is going to tie to my contract and award budgets. And this method does work really well if all of your programs are funded by a single funding award. But what I've seen is that as we grow and expand our programs, that no longer is true. And we have to combine multiple funding source and some unrestricted income in order to pay for it. So that benefit starts slipping away. And then we get into the challenges, which is I have found that using the funding source cost structure makes it harder to see how we're actually doing cost allocations. And in fact, I think it often leads to some, I don't want to say, I live in a divided world. I audit and I've got all that compliance stuff going on in my head. It's hard to turn it off. So they're violating the rules. They're not following the cost allocation rules. But more than that, I think they're deceiving themselves. If you're allocating costs based on, well, this funding source, they said they would pay this much towards our rent, that may not be the fair share at all for the cost of rent for that. So I think the challenge is it not only makes it less transparent, it also allows us to not think clearly about what it really costs to do each of our services. And you may say, well, I got bigger things to worry about than I'm not thinking clearly about the full cost of what it takes to do a service. And all I can say is all that has to happen is a major funder drops away and you realize what the problem is in not thinking clearly about the full cost of each of your services. And I hope we're gonna have time to go a little further into how sometimes using that funding source cost structure ends up limiting your flexibility in how you do cost allocation and getting you hung up on some rules about cost allocation where there's actually a different solution that would work better for you. And the other thing to remember is you're still going to report to the IRS on the 990. You're still going to have an audit that has to present the information as management fundraising in your different programs. So you're not going to get away totally from having to think on a functional level. And so in some ways, this is like a false dichotomy. It's just which one comes to the foreground. I think the biggest challenge or downside that I see in using the funding source cost center structure to present the annual budget is it turns into acronym soup. You know, you've got all these different funding awards if it doesn't have meaning to people. And so I think board members kind of check out because they don't know what's in this agreement, that VOCA contract, and they really don't need to know. What they need to know is what services are we trying to offer, how are we going to pay for them, and what are the gaps that our current funding sources aren't filling. So now, you know, here comes the auditor talk to just say, you know, you got a lot of governmental money, and you all know that when you start thinking about costs in a governmental agreement, you've always got to be sure that the costs are reasonable, necessary, and allowable. You always have to be sure that you're talking about which costs are going to occur in the time period that you're budgeting for, and that's where that chart that we looked at that realized that not all funding agreements align with our fiscal year. So we're going to talk about the expenses that are going to happen in our fiscal year, even though the grant period might start before the fiscal year or extend after. We got to break the expenses into the part that will happen in our fiscal year. They have to be allowable in the terms of what the funder is willing to pay for. And now we come to the toughest one of all. They have to provide benefit to achieving the objectives for which the funding is provided. Now that is like gobbledygook for most people, but what we're really talking about is it's easy enough when I'm talking about an award to offer services to victims of sexual assault, and I hire a sexual assault advocate, okay? That's fine. No problem showing how that is going to meet the objective of services for victims of sexual assault. What's hard is when I want to justify a part of the cost of my executive director, a part of the cost of my accountant, a part of the cost of the person who's maintaining my technology, when I want to justify that that's part of the cost of serving victims of sexual assault. I have to be able to prove that there is a benefit that is being provided by paying my bookkeeper or accountant or by paying my executive director. And that brings us to some of the tougher aspects of understanding budgeting and understanding the relationship between costs and a cost center. So the basic relationship is if it's a direct cost, you know, my sexual assault advocate as a cost of the sexual assault program or a cost of a sexual assault grant, there's no problem there. The problem happens when we have common costs. We have multiple services paid for by multiple agreements in a common facility. We've got all the technology and we have management of the organization. So we have to figure out how are we going to handle those costs, and we're going to move on to understanding this concept. Now this, you read this paragraph and it is truly, you know, your federal government speaking in its own Fed speak, but it has a really important message in it, which is, this is a you know, if you have federal funds, this is their rules, but most state funds now are taking the same definition of what is a cost objective. And they're saying you, the organization, get to decide how you define cost objective. And you could define it as a program or function, like I've been talking about, or you could define it as an award or a contract. It's your choice. So, but you have to make that choice before you're going to be able to figure out this issue of how to determine the benefit that is provided by shared or common costs. Because the benefit to what? Well, the benefit to a program or a function, or is it a benefit to a grant award? Either way, you just need to know, well, what is our cost center structure? And now I can figure out how I can demonstrate and allocate the benefit of common costs. So the whole deal in thinking about these common costs is consistency. We've got to be consistent in how we think about them. So we're talking about costs that benefit more than one cost objective. So that could be a cost that benefited more than one program, or it could be a cost that benefited more than one funding award, or it could be a cost that benefited more than one program and more than one funding awards that are supporting that program. But the concept that we're interested in is if it's a cost that benefits more than one cost center, and I'm using cost center and cost objective interchangeably, if it's going to benefit more than one, I have to figure out a way to fairly allocate it. In other words, to figure out, well, what's the fair share of this cost that should go to each cost center that benefits. And it's all about estimating because it's not knowable, right? Now, if I hire a sexual assault advocate and I have her time record and I know she worked, there's just no dispute about what benefited from her work. It was our sexual assault program, or you might say it was that VOCA grant that I had that we were paying that person through. But when you get into these costs that benefit more than one cost objective or cost center, it's all going to be about estimating. And so it's about choosing a method of estimating or allocating. And you can use different methods for different types of costs, but if it's the same type of cost, you need to use the same method to estimate the benefit. And there's like a core assumption here that is central to all government funding, and that is when you're talking about a cost that benefits all cost centers in your organization, it's got to be allocated fairly to all cost centers. And you can't say, oh, look at award number 3 there. They didn't put anything in there to pay for rent, so I can't charge rent to that cost center. Well, it's true you can't charge rent to that award, but that doesn't mean that you don't have to allocate a fair share of rent to that cost center, and you're going to have some other source of funds that will pay for it if that funder won't. Now, this is one of the reasons why I think it's helpful to think primarily in terms of program or function, because then you can say, well, I know what a fair share of the rent is for the sexual assault program, and I've got these 3 different awards that are paying for some component of the sexual assault program, and this one, for some weird reason, doesn't allow any rent. That still allows me to consider rent to be an expense of the sexual assault program cost center. And one of the key rules that we're dealing with here is you can't say it's a fair allocation plan if you skip certain cost centers because the funders in that cost center won't allow you to pay that cost. And where this really becomes significant is when we're talking about overall agency-wide administrative costs, because that's where we see funding agreements where one funder is willing to pay 10%, another one is willing to pay 5%, another one isn't willing to pay any at all. And that's where we have the possibility of distorting our whole cost allocation plan if we try to do it based on who will pay what. And Judy, were you waving a hand?
Oh, I was just saying, yeah, or a goose egg, right? That they're not going to pay anything.
Yeah,
But
yeah, big
okay,
zero, right.
so
And
question, sorry.
yeah,
So question is that, okay, we know like kind of morally that's a problem, right? Or sort of, you know, philosophically that's a problem, but you know, is this like, I think most, if not many, organization that's practically like what's happening, right? So like the county might
yes,
say, we're
and
only paying for the advocates. We're not paying for any of your overhead because we don't like overhead or we don't have money for that. So
right,
is this a problem that's like an auditable, like you could get
yeah.
tripped up in your audit? So say more.
Yes, and it is a problem. And I honestly, I think many auditors are fairly sloppy when an agency is small and they take the stance that, well, they sent the reports into the funders and none of them objected. So, you know, who am I to say that this is wrong? But once you trip the threshold where you're going to have the federal funds audit, what we used to call the A133, it's now called the single audit, you're going to see auditors do start paying attention to this. And unfortunately, I'm seeing times when it's actually a monitor coming through from a funding source. The monitor, you know, particularly in Washington, where in both domestic violence and sexual assault, there's been such great collaboration between the state and the programs, and monitors understand that you have to have management in an organization, and they understand that, you know, the whole point of this is to get the programmatic work done. But what has been happening around the country is when the feds come in and they send the inspector general in to audit the state, they're pressuring the state and they're saying to the state, wait a minute, you're allowing people to use cost allocation methods that are just obviously non-compliant. They're obviously wrong. And so suddenly we have monitors who are kind of being, I guess I shouldn't say beaten around the head by the feds, but that is what's happening. They're really being pressured by the feds. You should be paying attention to this. And so this is what is so frustrating when you are the person running a program, is you've been doing it this way for years and nobody has ever complained. And suddenly you have either an independent auditor or a monitor that turns up that says, but wait, how come you didn't put any share of administration to this cost center? That's not right. And so I think it is, and we're going to keep talking about this because there are ways that you can solve this problem. And one of them is to just get a fair cost allocation system displayed in your budget. Figure out what would be fair in terms of allocating all these costs, and then stand back and say, okay, that is the full cost of each of my programs. And then look at your funding agreements and say, okay, how much of that full cost can I get the funders that are paying for that program to pay? And the answer may be, no, they aren't going to pay the whole cost because they have a prohibition against any admin, or they've got some weird low rate for something. And then that's going to tell you, so if I want to ensure that I'm compliant, that's where I'm going to have to direct some of my unrestricted money, because I'm going to be compliant whether the funder is willing to accept the full cost. But of course, what's kind of exciting about what's going on right now is that there is this movement, and it is affecting governmental funders as well as foundation funders. There is a movement to recognize the full cost of services and to back away from some of this sort of, I won't pay for this, I won't pay for that. But until that movement has really taken force, The way I look at this is I want to maintain compliance so that nobody turns up at my doorstep one day saying that what I've been doing for 20 years is no longer acceptable. And I just have to say, and as an aside, I do a lot of work around the country, and this winter I was in Texas working with a rural program, really tiny community, but a lot of money because they're the only social service in town. And they had just been completely trashed by their latest monitoring visit from their state. And the state had accepted their cost allocation for 20 years. And because the state was under pressure from the feds, suddenly it was no longer acceptable. And it was so difficult to try to correct the allocation problems that had been in place for 20 years. It was kind of heartbreaking because honestly, this is the only place that's serving that rural area, and they just have to find a way through that problem. Okay, so let's just reinforce some of these common cost allocation mistakes. You cannot base your allocation on what some funder will put in the budget. That is not an allowable cost allocation methodology. And you can't just skip some cost centers. And I've seen people do that too. They've said, well, in our governmental awards, we get 10% for management or whatever you get, 15% for management. We get that. But over here, I get this foundation award and they don't want to pay management, so I just won't put any to that. You cannot do that. Let's talk about a more cheerful subject. That's a frustrating subject.
Kay, I want to just say that one of our participants just said that scenario you just described happened at their program, and that's really really unfortunate. And then for any of you that have VOCA awards, this is something to be paying attention to. If any of you have OVW money, this is something to be paying attention to. Those audits are making their way east to west, and now they're beginning to happen in our state. We really anticipate, the OIG, the Office of the Inspector General audits have started in our state, and we got to be prepared. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so I thought it would be helpful, I've been talking about agency-wide management to say, well, what am I talking about? And this is what I'm talking about. And there's a gap definition, and the feds pretty much follow this definition. Financial management is an agency-wide management function. If you do strategic planning for the whole organization, board support, a lot of executive directors spend time working with their boards. If you have somebody who's doing high-level planning and management for IT and HR functions, now I'm not talking about this is the person that can get the printer working again. That's not the management of IT. I'm talking about somebody who is a high-level manager who is doing the major planning in those areas. So these are the common agency-wide management costs. And this is where we get into more language nonsense problems in that, you hear about indirect and indirect rates and how am I going to collect my indirect? Well, one of the problems is that we're not all using the same definition of that term. We know what direct costs are. Those are easy. But this term indirect on a sort of just like a conceptual level, it means something that isn't direct. It means a cost that benefits more than one cost center, and you have to estimate the fair share that should be charged to all the cost centers that benefit, and that estimating is your cost allocation methodology. Now, I noticed in the survey that very few organizations have gone about solving this problem by negotiating an indirect cost rate. So I'm not going to talk about that a lot in this workshop for the smaller organizations. I'm going to say a little bit more about it when we're with the larger organizations. One of the challenges is that if you don't have any direct federal awards, you can't negotiate a federal indirect cost rate. There's a little bit more to that we'll talk about this afternoon too. I thought it might help to illustrate what I'm really saying here is that This is probably the most typical way that smaller organizations handle cost allocation. First they put costs that are direct costs into the programs, or if you are still using an award cost structure, it could be there. So those are all direct costs. And then over here, they have these shared costs that benefit more than one cost center. So they got rent, they've got the audit, which is an administrative cost. They've got accounting staff, that's another administrative cost. They've got utilities, that's another one of these common costs. So they've got them over here. And here's what happens through cost allocation. They're going to bring those to zero because they're going to divide up the rent, the audit, the accounting staff, and the utilities. They're going to divide them up among their cost centers, and they're going to report them out on a line item. Now, I know that sometimes we do this with rent and utilities, but what our funder has said is, no, I want to see a line item that is administration. I want to see it down here as a separate thing. So we would be summing up the audit, the accounting, probably some of the executive director, all those administrative costs. But the point being that first we have to identify what they are, these costs that benefit more than one cost center. Then we have to come up with an allocation methodology. And after we have that methodology, we can divide those costs up and report them in the total costs for the program. So this method, when you're in federal language, they would say this is a method that involves charging shared costs as direct costs. And why they would say that is that you don't have an indirect cost rate. So there's no line item here on the report that says indirect costs. We can't have that line item if we don't have an indirect cost rate. We could have a line item that said administrative costs. And in this example, it would combine these audit and accounting costs, and probably, you know, there'd also be the cost of a portion of the executive director. And I might just say that in smaller programs, it's really unusual that an executive director would be entirely performing administrative functions. I don't think I've ever seen that. They're definitely performing fundraising functions, and in most smaller organizations, they're performing program functions. They're performing direct supervision of people who are delivering some program services. And that takes us back, remember we were talking about the personnel schedule, that you don't want to put people into that administrative category just because their title sounds administrative. You want to think about what are they actually doing with their time. And so coming back here, when I've got the salaries displayed across the top into these different cost centers, it's not based on their job title, it's based on what they're spending time doing. And that's how we're coming to that distribution. Now, in this example that we looked at earlier, you'll notice that I had things like occupancy, that would be like the rent and sometimes the telephone and sometimes the utilities. And I have done what we just showed in the last slide. I've allocated it out among the other cost centers, so it doesn't appear as a separate line item. But when it came to admin, I did allocate that out and made it explicit how I had allocated the admin. So it's still, this example is still illustrating a direct, treating allocated costs as direct costs. And I'm going to skip over that one. I'm looking at time, and I know we have to wrap up here. I'm just going to say that that whole method that we were looking at back here, back there, this idea of allocating shared costs and charging them as direct costs, that is a different method than using an indirect cost rate. And later on, I'll give you some resources if you want to know more about these indirect cost rates. The so-called de minimis rate, 10% rate, there's a lot of misunderstanding about that rate. It isn't just any 10%, it's a specific calculation, and that's probably for another day to talk about that. And so here is my slide with some information that I hope will, if you're concerned about the de minimis rate, or you've been thinking about negotiating an indirect cost rate, this is the California Association of Nonprofits has just a great website section on this issue, and so a lot of good resources there. And if any of you are thinking about either using the 10% de minimis or negotiating indirect cost rate, I'm happy to share slide decks that I have from other webinars, and just email me and I'll send them to you. And particularly if you tell me what you're thinking about, I'll try to send you one that's kind of on target. Now, there's another piece that I want to talk about before we end, and I'm sort of worrying about time, and that is, remember I started this whole discussion of budgeting by saying personnel cost is your biggest cost. It probably is. And one thing to remember is that you're going to do your best estimate when you do the budget. You have a plan for each position. I want this person to work 50% time in the sexual assault program and 50% time in my emergency services program. And we have a plan, and you're putting that in the budget. But remember that when you are actually going to be charging costs to funding awards, if these are governmental awards, particularly if there's any federal money in that award, you are going to have evidence to support it. So being able to say, well, look, I told the person that they're supposed to work 50% in program 1 and 50% in program 2. That's why I charged their cost 50% and 50%. And your feds are going to say, nah, that's not it. You need to have a contemporaneously maintained record of what this person actually did, and it's got to be maintained by the person. They know what they did. And so they need to reflect on how they've directed their time and effort, and give you that information so that you can use that as the basis for charging their time to the various cost centers. So you might have told them to work 50% in cost center 1 and 50% in cost center 2, but reality got in the way, and it turned out to be they spent 75% of their time in cost center 1 and 25% in cost center 2. You've got to capture that information from them and make sure that your accounting reflects reality. And that's how you're going to charge to your awards. And this is one of the most common audit findings. Now, one of the problems is that that example that I gave, where I want this person to work 50% in counseling sexual assault victims and 50% in our emergency services center, the person is going to know, they're going to be able to observe, today I spent 4 hours with a victim, and then I spent 4 hours at the emergency service center. They can see it, so there's no problem in them writing it down. But a lot of the allocations that we're dealing with, people cannot see any distinction that is observable. And so to tell them, well, you better give me a time record that shows. And one of the main areas of non-observability is when I'm telling someone, well, look, you're just going to be counseling sexual assault victims, but we're going to pay you with 3 different grants. So I want you in your time record to show me when you were working on grant 1 and when you were working on grant 2 and when you were working on grant 3. And if the person is honest, they're going to say to you, well, you tell me what's the difference between those grants. I just see victims all day long, and I do what they need. And so if I force someone to give me a time record, I'm asking them to write down things they can't actually see. And I just don't feel that that is a good way to have a highly ethical organization. If someone feels I'm being told to write something down that I can't observe myself. And so here's the slide that really pertains to that. You know, if you've got people doing distinct roles, that's observable, and they can write it down. But think about the fiscal director, and we have some of them on our call today. you know, when I am posting journal entries and then I'm going to run the general ledger and I'm going to produce the financial statements, I defy you to observe, well, when I run that report, how many microseconds was devoted to thinking about program 1 or grant 3? It is not possible. And so to tell someone, I want a time record that shows how you divided your time, it's asking them to record the unobservable. And it's really true with the executive director. I mean, do you really want your executive director, as she attends a board meeting, to take a stopwatch with her and say, oh, I think they're talking about something that pertains to grant 3 here. I better measure that. They spent 2 minutes on that. Now they seem to be talking about something that pertains to grant 6. That would be absurd. And so when we're asking people to make time records of things they can't observe, we're asking them to do something that is really undoable. So instead, the whole concept of cost allocation is that you come up with a reasonable method for estimating the benefit that someone's time provided. And, you know, let's imagine that we do have a person who handles your central intake, and they are talking to people with all different issues. Now, I could give them a stopwatch and say, you know, measure it, but it would be much more effective to say, I'm going to use a justifiable allocation method for these non-observable time periods. And often we'll say, well, I'm going to say if I have twice as many people working in our sexual assault program as working in the DV, then I've got twice as many FTEs. I'm going to allocate these shared costs using the percentage of FTE. Some people like to use a percentage of direct costs as the basis for doing it. There's a few challenges with that, but I don't want to go into them now. You know, auditors love the idea of a transaction count. I consider this to be a ridiculous idea, but it's favored by auditors, and that is many of us have transaction counters on our accounting software, and they would say to my fiscal director, well, the way to allocate your time when you were producing those financial statements is look at the underlying transactions that were charged to each cost center. It has nothing to do with what I'm doing in preparing financial statements, but it is widely accepted by auditors. So there's different methods. Obviously, you got to choose one and write it down and put it in your cost allocation plan. Now, I know we're running out of time, and I just want to say a couple more things before we wrap up this morning. There are these proposed changes in the federal rules. Some of them are quite favorable to small organizations. Maybe we'll pick up a little bit more on this afternoon if people want to talk more about that, as we are going to be talking about compliance. But here's what I really wanted to get to. Now, we're ending, it's 11:02, and I hope all of you were planning to come to Yakima and spend the whole day together. And so this is, you know, remember that blissed out dog at the beginning? I want you to continue the bliss. I really want you to give yourself some time to absorb this, and to, if you possibly can, talk with someone else from your organization. If you're the executive director, talk with a program manager or talk with your finance person. We have questions for you to talk together about, and those were sent out to you, and maybe I'll even, I'm not going to risk changing my screen so you can look at them. There are questions for you to talk about. Probably from my point of view, the most important thing is this little piece, which is, at the end of those questions, and you know, I know you're going to feel pressed for time and that you need to look at your email and all of that, but I think it's worth talking about these questions even for 10 minutes together, because where it can go is that if you can think about which are the concepts we talked about this morning, really you feel like, I still don't quite get what she's getting at. If you just can even craft an email to me that says, we want to know more about this, I will get you an answer. And if you decide after this conversation that, you know, I'm kind of interested in whether we should shift the structure of our cost centers or shift our cost allocation approaches, if you would like to have some time to just talk individually with me, that's going to be part of the follow-up to this. And so it would really help to know how many organizations do want that time and to know what you would like to talk about, because it's possible that several of you will want to talk about the same thing and we could combine that. So if you do nothing else other than just have 10 minutes of discussion about what kind of follow-up you would like, that would be great. And with that, I just, it's a really difficult time. So I hope that you are pulling together, and I hope you can think about a beautiful stream to be pulling on, and that then we will be back together at 1:30 to kind of take the next step on this. And
okay, does that show the questions?
it does.
Great. Okay.
Wow.
Yes, it's a miracle.
That is a miracle.
Okay, so, okay, see you later.
Yeah.
Okay, should we start, or how are we doing on time? I guess it's 1:32.
Yep, we're good.
I think we have most everybody back.
Yes.
Okay, well, the first thing I wanted to say was thank you for those of you who did the questions and exercises. We saw some things come in through the chat that are really interesting, and there's another set of exercises at the end of this part. And what I saw in those chatted in questions was that some of them really it would be worthwhile answering to the whole group. So I'll tomorrow, or probably not tomorrow because I'm doing this session for larger groups, but the next day I'll work on a set of email answers to some of those questions, and we can send it out to everyone. So it's very helpful when both of the feedback that you're thinking about changes, but also specific questions. That's very, very helpful to me. So thank you for that. And now we're on to the second half. And again, I said this morning I had sort of a hope for before and after. Here's kind of what I'm thinking about the before right now, that I suspect that people are kind of in this state. And I hope not too many
I'm
are
still
in
there, Kay.
Okay. And what I'm hoping for as the after is just this ecstasy moment. And we all have different levels of ecstasy, and I like that level. So hopefully that's where we're going this afternoon, and we'll see whether we get there or not. But since we might have a few people who joined this afternoon and weren't here this morning, part of what we were saying this morning is this is a really hard time to be working in a domestic violence or sexual assault or victim assistance program. It's hard to be in any nonprofit. It's a really hard time to be an executive director. And just kind of the incoming fire is amazing. And so one of my hopes for this session is that you are able to just shut down your email and have kind of a moment of concentration while we think about something other than the virus and all the consequences that it's having. So that's what I hope will happen. And then when we do that webinar later on about the specifics of what are we going to do about the financial consequences of this virus, that'll be a time where hopefully things may have become clearer to some of us, and we'll have, I hope, some good news. There actually is some federal legislation that I think might be helpful, so I'm looking forward to talking about that. Okay, so what are we going to talk about right now? Well, again, going back to the surveys that you all sent in, we are going to do a little bit of discussion of some federal funds rules and why does anybody care about that, and a little bit of going deeper into this whole issue of administrative and shared costs. And then we're going to toss in another jargon term, procurement, and talk a little bit about that. Then we'll just sort of clear our minds from all that compliance talk and really get into the question of what is the financial information that your board really needs and that executive directors need and that program managers need. So I hope that will be useful. And then we'll wrap up with just a little bit of information about these changes in nonprofit accounting and reporting rules. And I think you're going to find that some of the changes are actually really helpful as you try to think about your finances in your organization. So at least I hope they will be helpful. And we're not going to dwell on the sort of technical tedium aspect of these rules. We're just going to try to cut to the chase of what might matter. So with that, the way we did it this morning, it worked for me. I hope it worked for you, that if you have questions as we're going along and you want to chat them in, Judy is watching that chat while I'm kind of paying attention to the slides and what I'm talking about. But periodically, I see her waving her hands in just, like, stop now. And she is telling me that there is something we need to respond to more quickly. And then there'll be pause points between these sections as well. So now you probably all remember about the Uniform Grants Guidance. That happened back in 2014. It's kind of old news today, but I mention it because, well, really for two reasons. One, it has some very direct impact on how we are supposed to treat administrative and other common costs if the money is coming directly from the federal government, but that's not true of many of our programs. We don't have any direct federal funds. What we have is federal money that has come to the state of Washington or to one of the jurisdictions or to a tribe that has gotten passed through to another entity, handed on to us. And so a lot of you get a number of VOCA grants that are federal money coming to the state of Washington. State of Washington goes through a process and then passes that money on to you. But of course, they pass all these federal rules right along with the dollars. And the other thing that I've seen as I've looked through some of the Washington contracts is that sometimes even when the particular agreement that you're dealing with does not have any federal money in it, just for consistency's sake, state and local government are inserting some of the requirements of the Uniform Grants Guidance, which we call 2 CFR 200. CFR is Code of Federal Regulations. So I think it's worth talking about these rules. And of course, the first question before you talk about it is, do these rules apply to the agreement that we have in our organization? And the answer to that question is they probably apply to some of the agreements you have, but not to all of the agreements you have. And what I've found is because of this consistency that we talked about this morning, the need to allocate cost consistency, treat costs consistently, if you have some money that makes you subject to these requirements, it really is easier just to set the whole system up to be compliant with the requirements. Now, the feds love jargon, and so they have a particular term to describe those of us who get our money not directly from the federal government, but through the state or through a city or county or sometimes through another nonprofit entity. We're called sub-recipients. And so these rules that I'm about to talk about, they apply to sub-recipients. Now, there is another way that we may get some of our money. Some of us are subcontractors on some agreements, and that is a different meaning than sub-recipient. In a minute, we're going to look at what's the difference, but let me say a few more words about the sub-recipients. So in general, if you are a subrecipient, it's going to mean that all those federal rules that are in 2 CFR 200 do apply to you, even though you got your money from a pass-through entity. And one of the ways that you'll know you're dealing with an agreement that is trying to make you be a subrecipient is that you'll see some reference in the agreement to the fact that you might need to have the special kind of audit for federal money that we used to call the A-133 audit, and now we call it the single audit. So that's a tip-off. Now, there actually are rules right now that say that if, say, the state of Washington is serving as a pass-through entity, they are required to put into their agreement with you, the subrecipient, all this detail about, first of all, the fact that you are a subrecipient, and secondly, well, what is the federal source, and are there additional CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, requirements? That's all supposed to be in your agreement. Now, in my experience reading a lot of agreements with states and counties and cities, they don't always get it all into the agreement. So even if they didn't say it explicitly, it's probably true. So if you're just sitting on the edge of your chair wondering, well, am I a subrecipient or am I a subcontractor? Here's a sort of a comparative chart. This is going to have another meaning for some of you who are not only yourselves subrecipients, but you have subrecipients of your own. In other words, you are passing dollars that you're getting from a funding source on to another nonprofit. Now, I find this happens quite a bit in rural areas. It sometimes happens in culturally specific community organizations, because what's typically going on there is your organization may have been capable of applying for the funds and meeting the requirements to receive the funds, either from the state or the federal government. But in order to do the work, you know that there are other organizations, other entities in your area that really could do a better job, or particularly in rural programs, they may be located out closer to where people live. And so you're going to pass money on to them. And those organizations that you are passing money on to may be your subrecipients, or they might be your subcontractors. So it's important to know which they are and which you are. So here's the quick and dirty on subrecipient and subcontractor. Subrecipient has to meet the same compliance requirements as the pass-through entity that gave them the money. And, you know, right before we took a break, Judy was talking about the fact that state agencies are now going through federal funds audits where these inspector generals are turning up in the state and they're combing through the state systems to say, are you compliant? Okay, so those requirements that are being imposed on the state, they are actually imposed on you too if you receive the money and are a subrecipient. And a typical sign that you are a subrecipient is if you are empowered to determine who is eligible for your services and what the services you can provide them are. Now, I don't mean you get to write the regulations about eligibility. I mean that you are considered to be knowledgeable enough that when a given person is requesting assistance, you make the judgment about whether they are eligible. You don't have to call up your funder and ask. You make that judgment. And, you know, particularly in victim services, people need a lot of different things, and you are empowered to make the decision about which of the various services are most appropriate to provide. So you don't have your funder making those detailed decisions for you. And probably the overarching characteristic of a subrecipient agreement is that the whole purpose of the agreement is so that your organization can provide services for your community or for individuals in need. And it's not that you're providing services for the pass-through entity. Now that kind of bridges us over to, well, what is a subcontractor? Because in certain circumstances, nonprofit organizations actually do function as subcontractors to the state or to the county or to another nonprofit. And what would be an example of that? Well, not so frequently in domestic violence, but I know some of you are community action agencies and multi-purpose agencies. It's not unusual to have a program where you're trying to help clients get job experience, and so you have various social enterprise programs for them to work in. Well, suppose you had a janitorial services social enterprise program, and you were able to get the state or the county to select you to provide janitorial service for some public building. Well, the agreement that you would get from the state or the county on that is not a subrecipient agreement, it's a subcontract agreement. And the same would be true if you are going to go out and you're going to find a mental health clinic. And the reason you want to have a relationship with them is that from time to time, you want people with who are psychiatrists or psychologists to come in and work with your staff or consult with your staff. You're going to enter into an agreement with that mental health agency to purchase those services, but they're not going to be a subrecipient. They're going to be a subcontractor who is providing that service to you. So when you're a subcontractor, you don't expect subcontractors to have mastered all the federal regulations and to be determining compliance with them. You just expect them to do what it says in your subcontract, provide a certain kind of service. And if you did have a subcontractor that was going to actually see your clients, maybe you wanted to get some mental health counseling for a client that you couldn't provide yourself, if it's a subcontract agreement you're using, your organization is going to determine whether that client is eligible and whether you're allowed to use the money for them to get counseling services. You're not passing that on to the subcontractor. In fact, your subcontractor may just be a freelance mental health person that is just doing this as a business. So that's a little bit about the difference between subrecipients and subcontractors. Now, it's important because you need to know if you're a subrecipient so that you can be sure that you're complying with all the raft of federal regulations that go with that. But it has another relevance, and that is this subject of procurement. Now, I have to admit that when I first heard the word procurement, it was in the context of sexual trafficking. It was procuring. And I really didn't think of it as having anything to do with either federal regulations or anything else that I would particularly want my organization to be involved with. But actually it has a big meaning, and it means purchasing stuff. So whether it's goods or services, we have to engage in procurement. But here's the catch. Remember that long discussion of, is it a subrecipient or a subcontract? These rules apply when we're talking about services and we're going to purchase them through a subcontract. These rules would not apply if what we were doing was entering into a subrecipient agreement with another organization. So let me give another example of that, and I'll just put this back up on the screen when I say this. Suppose I have received funding for some type of victim services in a fairly large rural area, and there's a part of the county that is really a long drive away, and I know there is a local organization up there that would be capable of delivering the kinds of services that are required. I might enter into a subrecipient agreement with them so that I could say, well, if people in your community way far away from where we are need this type of service, you have funding, but you have to meet all the same federal requirements as we do because you are a subrecipient. Well, if that's the nature of our agreement, that we don't have to follow procurement rules to make the decision about having that agreement with the subrecipient. On the other hand, in that same sort of geographic situation where I just can't get staff up there to this part of the county that's so far away, maybe I'm going to find an individual counselor up there in that area. And the most efficient thing to do is for me to subcontract with that person to do some counseling there locally where people can reach the person. I'm not making them a subrecipient. I don't expect them to make a decision about who's eligible or exactly what's allowable. We'll do that. They're just going to deliver the service as a subcontractor. That subcontractor is going to be subject to these procurement rules. And it's really us, the organization, that is subject to these rules, because these rules are going to determine how we go about making decisions of who or what business we're going to do business with. And they're kind of elaborate rules. And the starting point for these rules are that if we've received money that makes us comply with the federal requirements, first thing we have to be concerned about is being sure we have a written procurement policy and procedure that our board has adopted and that we keep updating, because these procurement rules just keep shifting around. So you have to keep updating all the time. And essentially what these rules are going to do is they're going to set thresholds, dollar amount thresholds, and they're going to tell us, well, if it's less than this amount of money, you can buy it in this way. But if it's more than that amount of money, you've got to jump through a number of hoops before you can purchase it. And because it's all targeted around how big is the purchase, there's a very important rule that you can't break up purchases in order to get it down to a lower amount, and no chopping up a purchase. So let's look at the rules. And this is sort of annoying to me, because there's a good news, bad news aspect. The good news is that the feds have now made it clear that when they are talking about these procurement thresholds, they want you to pay attention to another guiding document that's called the FARS, F-A-R-S, and I think I've got a slide on it in a little bit. And the FARS are the rules for all the acquisition of everything by the federal government. And they set these threshold dollar amounts, and of course they keep changing because they've indexed them so that as inflation occurs, the thresholds get larger. So, you know, the message is, part of why you have to keep updating your procurement policy is you want to be aware of, did they change these threshold amounts? So these are the current threshold amounts. And the problem that is going to make this confusing is that in some of your state agreements, they're going to be different threshold amounts. So the key on procurement is always knowing which threshold amounts you're bound by for which types of purchases. So the feds created this concept called micro purchase, and they are currently saying that's a purchase under $10,000. And then they created a criteria, a category called small purchases, which means they're below the simplified acquisition threshold. And right now, the simplified acquisition threshold is greater than $250,000. Now, in most smaller nonprofits, it would be ridiculous to say, gee, we're not going to really do much of anything about evaluating a purchase until after it's over $250,000. That would just be the height of irresponsibility to do that. And in a really small organization, you might say, well, even saying a $10,000 threshold for a micro purchase, that's just too large for our organization. We want more control than that. And they raised all these thresholds because the colleges and universities wanted them raised. So an important thing before we go into more detail is to know that you may always set your thresholds lower than these. You just can't set them higher. So let's look at what they actually mean. In a micro purchase, remember that's if you're using the federal threshold, that's under $10,000. A responsible person for your organization has to determine that the purchase is necessary and that the price they're about to pay for it is reasonable. Now, we used to say that they needed to go comparison shopping and print things off the web to show, I saw 3 different prices and this was reasonable. That's no longer required. But remember, your procedures can be more limiting than the federal rules. They can't be less limiting. So maybe in your organization, you're going to say, no, that is crazy. We are not going to make a $5,000 purchase without comparing prices from at least 3 possible sources. So again, this is why you want to get your procurement policies written for what fits for your organization. Now, the next threshold the feds want to offer is that if it's more than 10,000 but less than 250,000, that's the small purchase, then they say you need to have a description of what you're going to buy. You should obtain some price quotes, and you should have written documentation about how you decided among those quotes. Now, remember, there's no requirement that you would always choose the cheapest price. The requirement is that you would make the best decision, and that would take into account things like the quality of the goods, the availability of the goods or services, your past experience with vendors. And this is where, sometimes it's very important in culturally specific communities that you're going to be purchasing from culturally specific service providers or vendors. And so you are not dealing with a requirement that you always choose the cheapest. You are supposed to choose the best. And so in a lot of culturally specific organizations, part of your criteria for what is the best is, well, this has to be culturally appropriate to the people that we serve. Okay, now what if you were going to make, in federal threshold language, a purchase greater than $250,000? Well, then it's going to become much more elaborate. And I think for most of us, and this is only going to happen when we're working on like a building expansion, or, we're going to build a new building. And it's kind of hard to imagine something that you would be buying subject to procurement. Because usually if you're thinking, well, I want to use this other organization that can provide some of our services way away from us, that's typically, if we're getting up to this level, it's going to be a sub-recipient agreement, not a subcontract agreement. But just in case, shelters do major renovations, and so we do occasionally make these large purchases. And also, in most of my clients, we don't go for this 250,000 threshold. We typically bring that back down to maybe $100,000 or sometimes lower, because we think that when you're smaller, you have to impose control at a lower level. So what do you have to, but for the federal rules, if you're using the 250, what do you have to do? Well, you have to have written specifications, and that's where you describe what goods or services are we going to buy, and it's got to be described very clearly exactly what has to be true about those goods or services. You have to solicit bids or proposals. In other words, you have to make it known that you're about to buy, and there's a lot of requirements there in terms of being sure that you make it known to businesses and providers that are women or minority owned or in high unemployment areas, essentially disadvantaged communities, that we have to make the information available to them so they know we're looking to buy. You also have to have a written description of how you're going to evaluate proposals. What are your criteria for deciding which one is best? You've got to have documentation of your effort to obtain bids from the disadvantaged vendors. And then finally, when you have made your decision about who you're going to do business with, you need to document, well, why? Why did you make that decision? Yeah, Judy.
Hey, so Kay, could you, I want to say something and then ask you a question. So for folks, if your program has an OVW grant, an OVW contract, a Federal Office on Violence Against Women contract, or you are a subrecipient. So for example, say that your local jurisdiction has a grant to encourage arrest, or a rural grant, and it goes for, some of the money goes to law enforcement, some goes to the prosecutor's office, and some goes to the SADV program. So part of, I think, what you're saying, Kay, correct me where I'm wrong, is that people need to know that even if the entity that has the federal contract hasn't told you, you're still subject to the federal rules. And there's a special conditions letter, and then there's all these, accounting requirements about how you spend the money. And so if they haven't, if you have one of those contracts and you're contracting out, you need to be sure to share those special conditions and,
Yes.
there's OVW has these trainings that are mandatory, but that are being canceled right now or postponed because of the public health issues. But there's a lot available, but this is definitely an area where people get into a lot of trouble. Is around
It
the special
is.
conditions and the things like this vendor stuff. Now, I will say for myself that this whole vendor, requirement has, like, I take it really personally. I feel like, of course, we're making good decisions. What do you mean I have to do this meaningless pushing paper around? It's like, why do we have to do this endless processing? But and maybe Kay, one of the things that we could do as a follow-up is just share with people, like, where could you go and get a really good sample procurement policy. But like the whole idea is that we're not doing self-dealing, or I don't know I can't remember what the other thing's called, where you just like do favorable contracts for your own
Right.
relatives or something, right? So that's
Right. It's conflict of interest.
yeah, conflict
This
of
is
interest,
all. This is
because we have
all
so much
about
money, right?
saying you're
So,
right.
so,
But
but it's definitely, having, like, in terms of the low-hanging fruit around not getting in trouble, having clean audits, and clean monitoring visits, having our timesheet data that shows that people actually, that you're invoicing based on actual time and not just how you allocated, but how people are actually spending their time. And then having a procurement policy that you are following. Most of the you're really not going to have to use this procurement policy most of the time, because most of our purchases are under $10,000, right?
right.
um, so like those two things are just, you're already way ahead in the game.
Yes.
I also wanted to
I,
point out, we have somebody, one of our participants has said that they are now a subgrantee on some contracts and for DV, and now they're also a subrecipient, so both with their DV and their child advocacy centers. And now they have to be both invoicing and then paying invoices, and this is completely
yes.
new and confusing. And so yes, it is, and there's really good simple ways to do it. If you didn't catch earlier, Kay, you had said that one of the things we're doing to because we are not meeting in person in Yakima's is that we have more time. So Kay, you had offered that people could contact you directly for some follow-up sessions, some short
Mm-hmm.
phone or video conference sessions. So we'll go into that a little bit more before the end of the day.
Okay. Well, yes, and I also wanted to say that in that particular situation that you were just describing, where an organization is both a subrecipient, they're getting federal money through a state contract, and they are also functioning as what's called a pass-through entity, and they now have their own subrecipients. We're going to talk about that more tomorrow with the larger organizations, because that was raised as an issue. And so there's some good slides, and maybe we can share that slide deck with everyone if you're dealing with those issues. And the other thing I wanted to say is that there are sample procurement policies. I have a lot of trepidation about encouraging people to start there, because one of the rules in federal compliance is that whatever is in your procurement policy is what you have to do. And so there's been a lot of confusion when people develop their own procurement policy. They get a good template. They set up thresholds that are lower than these because they just think this is ridiculous. And then they don't follow their own rules because somebody goes to a workshop and they hear the general rules. So this is a frustrating thing. And actually, when you read those procurement policies, you're going to see that a big element in them is how are you going to monitor yourselves to be sure that you're following the policy? Because you don't want some auditor to find out that you didn't do it. You want to find it yourself and correct the problem, which is usually just really a training and review problem. Now, I want to talk about one of the more painful parts of procurement.
If I could just, Kay, if I could
Yeah.
just say, I think you're really correct that for most people, I'm not seeing anything in the chat here or in the Q&A, but for most people, this procurement issue is not going to be really relevant because the grant, their budget sizes are smaller. I think the only place where it could be relevant, it might be like a rural program that subcontracts with some tribes. But even in those cases, if it's not federal funds, if it's maybe some foundation funding or something like that, then it might be less of an issue. So I guess a question that I have is this, like, if a program just has state funding, like DSH has formula funds and maybe a VOCA contract, do people need to do this or not?
Yes, if you have that VOCA contract, that's federal. And and remember that this is a rule that applies both if you're just receiving federal funds from a pass-through entity, like from the state of Washington. There's federal money wrapped up in one of your state agreements, then you got to follow these rules. It's also true that if in addition to that, you're a subrecipient and you also have your own subrecipients where you're passing money on to others, then the implication of that is you have to make sure that those that you are passing the money on to, that they're following these rules. So, I mean, it's hard enough for you to figure out how to follow these rules, and the state is monitoring you to be sure that you are. But now if you have subrecipients, you have to figure out how you're going to monitor those subrecipients to be sure they're following the rules. So it is a good thing that for these smaller organizations that very few of them have subrecipients, because, most of us have all that we can handle just to take care of our own staff and follow our own rules. And it's really hard to find time to go check on some other organization and see if they're following the rules. So just reality.
Yeah, I mean,
so I want to mention,
well, just that, like, even if they do have subrecipients, it's hard for me to imagine when people would have something that would be over $10,000.
Right, but remember the issue would be that the subrecipient is supposed to have a policy and procedure if they're truly a subrecipient, not a subcontractor.
Mm-hmm.
So we're supposed to see, do you have one? Is it reasonable? Does it comply with the rules? It's the monitoring. Okay, well, I think we should keep going.
Okay.
And these sole source or non-competitive purchases, it's not a tremendously big issue unless you set your thresholds low, and then it may be, because there may be times when you really don't want to go through considering other providers. You just want to get on with getting an agreement with an organization that you think can do the work. So here's my tip. Check your agreements, all of your agreements, to see what they say about procurement. Some of them are just going to reference the federal rules, and that's what we went through, or they'll reference the uniform guidance. That's what we talked about. Or they'll reference 2 CFR 200, which is just another way of saying the uniform guidance. But some of them are going to have some specific thresholds that are coming from the particular organization, the particular part of the state, or the particular part of a city, where they've got their own rules that may be lower than these thresholds. So look at your agreements to make sure that you understand what rules apply to you. And this is finally the reference to that FARS. If you want to look up thresholds, you can see it there. And then you can remember to follow your own thresholds. And with that, I was going to stop talking about procurement and go on to talk about essential financial information. But we could pause a minute and say, anybody want to hear anything else about procurement? I think we've sort of taken that as far as anybody wants to go. The most common problem that I find in visiting my clients is that drafting that procurement policy and procedure document has been on somebody's to-do list for the last 3 years. And it's It's just the project you never get to. And so this is like, yeah, this would be a good time. Maybe if you're locked in your house, maybe you could work on it. Or borrow one from somebody else. Okay, so let's move on to financial information. So Judy knows I've always been on boards. I'm sort of a compulsive board member. In fact, you know, the joke in my family is that when my daughter was in kindergarten and they were going around the room asking, you know, what do people's parents do? And my daughter said, well, you know, Chris works at a hospital and K is a meeting. And that was her understanding of why I was constantly going to these board meetings. So I've always been on boards, and I've always gravitated towards understanding the finances of the organization. And one of my great frustrations as a board member is that I feel like sometimes the board is given so much financial information, so many financial documents, that most board members, it's just, I mean, they know they should be responsible. They know they should provide oversight, but it's just a maze. And, you know, if I go into a board meeting and I see somebody handing board members a 10-page financial report, or I've been to meetings where it's a 20-page financial report, and I just think, you know, this is ridiculous, because no one is going to be able to make sense about all of that. And so I think it's really helpful to hone in on what is the information our boards really need most to fulfill their responsibilities. Because after all, as a board member, I've really made a promise to the state that I will be sure that we as a whole have this organization operate lawfully, but also that we'll use our resources only for the purposes of our mission. And so it's that high-level oversight that I've made a commitment to. And of course, part of that oversight, and particularly in domestic violence, sexual assault, is I feel like as a board member, I'm committed to being sure that this organization keeps going so that those services can be provided for the community. And if we get to the point where we can't keep going, we've really failed in our responsibility to sort of hold up the mission and make sure that we are managing wisely. Now, sometimes, you know, we've done everything and it still can't be put together, but I hate to see boards surprised if they come to a point where they just can't keep going. So here's what I want to see when I'm a board member, so that I can have the ability to offer some useful oversight, not micromanagement, not trying to do the job of the executive director, but actual oversight in terms of the board's job of upholding the mission and setting the priorities and being sure that we are using our resources wisely and being sure that we are sustainable, that we can be here. So I want a balance sheet, and we're going to look at samples that gives me the assets and liabilities and the net assets. I want a statement of activities. That's accountant speak for revenues and expenses for the whole organization. We're going to talk about that. I want to know that the executive director is seeing statements by cost center, that our revenue and expense statement by cost center. And we talked this morning, that might be by program, or it might be about funding award. As a board member, I probably don't want to spend a huge amount of time dwelling on those statements. I want to be able to have access to them if we start having difficulty in a particular cost center. So we'll look at some examples of that. I always want to see what has actually happened, the actual revenue and expenses for the year to date compared to the budget. We took the trouble to make a budget, the board adopted the budget. I want to see if it's working. And if I can't get that comparison of what is actually happening to what we thought was going to happen, what we approved happening, then it's not very helpful. And finally, this last bullet point, this is not any kind of GAAP required statement. There is no generally accepted accounting principle that says you have to do year-end projections. In fact, most accountants hate projections because they're estimates. But as a board member, what helps me more than anything else, and it's going to be so important now that we're having this really difficult period with the virus, is, yeah, you can report to me, well, this is happening and that's happening and the other thing is happening. But as a board member, I can't form any picture of that. What I need is a projection that tells me, so what's it going to look like by the end of our year? That's what I want to know, because then we can talk about that together and we can problem solve together about, is there anything we could do to get a better outcome? So I thought it would be helpful to show a sort of standard balance sheet. And I know one of the things that just drives people crazy about accountants is that we use different terms to describe the same thing. And so you may have a report that looks very much like this, and it might say balance sheet up at the top of it. That's fine. It's just a different way of expressing it. And now let's see if I can get my little pointer to come up again. Okay, so now in this particular example, I did something that is very important to me as a board member. I gave us 2 points of comparison. This is for an organization that ends its fiscal year on June 30th, so that was the end of our last fiscal year. That's where things stood. This is a report at the end of September, so the first 3 months of the year have gone by. And what I'm trying to do a comparison of is, okay, this is where we are now. How is it different from where we were 3 months ago? Now, when I am treasurer of a board, I push for actually having this be the immediate prior month. That's what I'm most interested in. But other people prefer it to be the prior quarter end or the prior year end. Just you have to have a comparison to something. And, these statements all have assets. They all have liabilities. Assets are things we own that are of value. Liabilities are things we owe to other parties. And then here's the real business end, the restricted or unrestricted net assets. Now, net assets, you may be used to hearing this called fund balance. That was the language a while back. Or you might be using QuickBooks and nobody ever bothered to change the terminology, and so it may say equity. But it's all the same concept. And a very broad way of expressing this concept is, what if we gathered up all these assets, our cash, our grants receivable, and our land and buildings if we own a building? What if we gathered all that up? What if we paid off all our debts? So the accounts payable, and if we have a mortgage on the building we own, pay that off too. What would be left? And the answer is, well, what would be left is our net assets. And what's important here in these net assets is that we have to separate them into those that are unrestricted, meaning our board can make any decision that we think is compatible with our mission, any decision that we believe is the right thing to do with the unrestricted net assets. But down here, and this is the old language here, we'll look at the newer language in a minute. The old language was temporarily restricted net assets. We're now calling those net assets without donor restrictions, but the same thing. And the important point here is that because this portion of our net worth has restrictions from our donors, our board can't just decide to spend it on whatever we think might be important. We have to fulfill those restrictions because we accepted the money with restrictions. So what am I looking for when I get a balance sheet like this? Well, one thing I'm very happy about, if it looks like this, is it's all on one page. Because one of the things I found over the years is most people cannot hold information when they are looking at 2 pages, especially if we print them back to back. But even if we have them side by side, it's not possible to form a good picture in your head. So this is a 1-page balance sheet, and what am I going to look at when I see it? Well, the first thing I'm going to look at is the cash position. And my question when I'm comparing to a prior period is our cash going up or is it coming down? And another question, we're not going to get into detail here, but another question that I ask is it enough cash? And I can't really answer that question until I'm looking at the revenues and expenses and I can see what our total expenses for the year, our expenses for a month are going to be, because there's only enough cash in relation to what's the demand on our cash going to be. So I may be looking at a balance sheet that has $50,000 in cash, and that may be perfectly enough for a very small organization that only spends about $5,000 or $10,000 a month. Whereas if I were looking at a balance sheet that maybe had $500,000 in cash, that might not be enough for an organization that spends $1 million a month. So looking at cash and thinking about is it enough, you've got to say in relation to about how much cash has to flow out every month. Now, the other thing I'm going to look at right away is the net assets, and I'm going to look at both those with and without donor restrictions. And I'm going to actually go back and look at our example to tell you why I'm interested in that. I really want to know, is it going up or down? And here it looks like the unrestricted actually went up a little bit. And so I want to know the direction of change. And one of the things that's going to be really important as we go through this financially difficult time, where some of us are going to burn through our cash pretty quickly, especially if springtime was when we usually have our big fundraising event and we can't have the event. It may be a very hard time. And so as a board member, I want to be able to see clearly when I read that we have $1.1 million in unrestricted net assets. I want to understand how much of that is actually tied up in our land and building, because it particularly for shelters, if we've bought a building, or maybe we have several buildings, that's probably a good thing in terms of we have a place to operate, but you can't pay the payroll with the building. And so I've got to be aware of what is the composition of those net assets. And at our webinar that we're going to do in a couple of weeks about coping with financial crisis or hardship, we'll talk more about that. The other thing I pay attention to is the net assets with restrictions, because I want to be sure that management is keeping track of those restrictions. See, that's just encouraging to me right here to see that line that tells me, okay, they are understanding that some of our net assets have restrictions and some don't. But the next question is going to be, well, how are we supposed to use those net assets? Are those for things that are just expenses that we're going to have in the normal course of business in the months that follow? That's good. That's available to keep us going. But if this is for some project that we may not even get to because we're so busy coping with the crisis, this may not be much help to us. So it's important that the board knows that we're tracking restrictions and also has some understanding of what those restrictions are about. And the final thing I put on my list as a board member is I do take a look at the payables and at the receivables. Now, the payables are what we owe to others, and what I'm particularly interested in a small organization. If I start seeing that what we owe is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, particularly if I'm in a small town, we probably owe people in our town. We probably aren't paying our bills. And that's pretty significant to our town and to our reputation. So I do pay attention to that as a board member. And the other thing I pay attention to is a situation like this one. At Just 3 months ago, we only had $81,000 in receivables, and now we have $401,000. What does that mean? Well, probably in our case, we are in some cost reimbursement agreements where we've had to send in invoices that say what our costs were, and we're waiting to be paid on those agreements. And so my question is going to be, is something wrong? Is this slowing down? And the answer may be, and Washington is always a little more efficient than Oregon, but in Oregon, you know, when times are tough, the reimbursement slows down. And so I would be concerned if I saw that, and I would ask a question of the executive director. Why are our receivables growing, and is there something we need to do about it? Now, the reason why I've spent a fair amount of time talking about the balance sheet is that I often find that people think that the board should be more interested in the revenues and expenses because they approve the budget. And don't they want to see all the detail blow by blow on the revenues and expenses? And I would say, no, as a board member, I want to see the balance sheet. I want to know, do we have enough cash? Are our net assets growing or shrinking? If we have restricted net assets, do we know what those restrictions are for and how we're going to handle them? And are we paying our bills on time, and are we collecting? Because, you know, if we have lots of delays in collecting our receivables, sooner or later, we're not going to have enough cash. So those are issues that the board needs to be aware of and maybe can help. And I'll say a little bit more about that on the next time.
Hey, Kate, could I add
so what else? Yeah.
could you go back to that other slide? So the also
sheet?
having worked at you know, DV program with a very small budget at the time and other programs, is that I'm interested in the burn rate. So I'm going to go to the are you going to cover that later?
Well, we talked a little bit about days of cash, and I'm going to talk about it again. Okay. So yeah.
But I'm looking at the budget, and I want to know how much does it cost a month, and then how many months cash do we have to pay that, and then it has to be cash that's not restricted. So I'm going to look down and say, like, you know, a very typical problem would be we got a grant, but it's for something that we now can't do because our community's in this other crisis, and did we spend that money, but we didn't fulfill the purpose.
And that's a really good point, Judy, because this actually illustrates exactly how things can go wrong right here. Okay, how much cash did we have at September 30th? We had $160,000. How much have we taken in restricted money? $250,000. I think that in our shortage of cash, because we've got these receivables so high, I bet you we're spending down our restricted cash. And so then even if we had the mind space to go ahead and do the project, what are we going to do it with if we spent the cash? Now, you know, foundations, I think they're not worried about, oh, you dipped into our cash this month because of a slow reimbursement. But if what I have to say to them at the end of 3 months is, we can't do that project because we don't have the cash at all, and we don't have a way to replenish it, that's not going to be good. Yeah, good point, Judy. Thank you. Okay, well, what about the statement of activities? And a lot of us would call this the revenue and expense statement. And what I'm interested in is I want to see the organization-wide net income. Did revenue exceed expense? I'm particularly interested as a board member in the most uncertain revenue targets, and those are usually fundraising. Occasionally, if you're charging fees for things, that's pretty uncertain. And I really want to be sure my statements cause me to pay attention to, are we hitting our targets? I'm interested in if we have some unexpected cost overruns or under expenditures, because since so many of us are on a cost reimbursement basis in our funding agreement, under expenditures are a problem too, because that probably means that we're not getting everything done that we're supposed to get done, and it definitely is going to mean that we're not going to collect the whole amount of the award if we don't expend the funds. And I added to the list this projected year-end results because as a board member, that's actually what's most meaningful to me of all. So let's take a look at an example of a statement of activities. It's got unrestricted revenues here. It's got expenses here. It's got the increase or decrease in unrestricted net assets here. Now, some of us are going to do this second part of the report. Others of us are not set up to do this. I find it very helpful if you can do it, and that is to break out the activity and the restricted money. And I don't want to go into a lot of detail in this session on that, but it is, if you're talking with your accountant, a good conversation would be, how are we showing restricted funds? But as you're going to see in a minute, when we start talking about some of these clarifications in accounting rules, most of the government money that we're getting through these grants and agreements, although it has many, many, many restrictions on it. In other words, you read that agreement and it says you can't spend it on this, you have to spend it on that. So from a management standpoint, it is restricted. But from an accounting standpoint, it may not be showing up as restricted. And that is a whole much longer conversation. So what I really want to take away from this part of the conversation is that what is helpful to me as a board member is to see, in this case, you know, we've gone through 3 months of our fiscal year. I find the year-to-date so much more helpful than an individual month. Management has to look at it month by month, but as a board member, what really matters is, as we've gone through the first quarter of the year, what income have we had, what expenses have we had, and what is the net? And then I want to compare it to the budget. Now, some of us like to compare it to the annual budget. So this is my first quarter compared to the full year budget, and I figured out what percentage we realized. That means it came in as income or we had it as expense. Other people prefer to use a year-to-date budget where they've already gone through the annual budget and they've said, well, in the first quarter, this is the revenue that we think we can bring in. Either way works, but if you're doing a year-to-date budget by dividing the annual budget by 12 and then saying, oh, the year-to-date budget is 3/12, that's meaningless. If you've actually thought about, well, in the first quarter of the year, certain kinds of income are slow. In the second quarter, it might be our contribution income is really good around the year end. So if you've actually analyzed your annual budget to put it into a year-to-date budget, that could be useful. Some people prefer comparing the actual to the budget with a variance. I prefer percentages because it draws my eyes more quickly to where there might be problems. So we're a fourth of the way through the year, and look at this. We haven't had much activity in our special events. And, you know, that's where having a year-to-date budget that was accurate could be useful, because maybe we don't do the event until after the first of the year, so I don't need to worry about this. So because there are so many things that can throw off either a variance or a percentage, as a board member, I actually find the year-end projection more useful, because what I want to know from my executive director is, how do you think this story is going to look at the end of the year? What you know, we budgeted $30,000 from foundations. Do you think we're going to get it? And here I can see that the executive director is saying, no, I don't think so. I think we'll do good to get 20,000. You know, we budgeted 630,000 from government grants and contracts. Well, we think we're going to be pretty close, 620. We budgeted 50,000 from the event. You still think that's right. So these numbers are going to get updated every time. And now, maybe as we've learned, hey, we're not having an event, we're going to drop this projection and say, well, you know, we're going to do a special appeal to donors, but I don't think we're going to get the same amount as if we were able to do our big event. Yeah.
Quick question, Kay. So for this last column, projected year end, this is not an accounting column, am I correct? This is everything else is accounting.
This is a judgment column.
Yeah, so this is everything
right.
else
Well,
is.
This is the budget that we worked on this morning. Then this is accounting. This is math. We just took the actual to the budget. But this, no bookkeeper or accountant can fill this out. This is a collaborative effort with the executive director, and if you have somebody raising money, that person, to figure out what do we think is really going to happen. Now, you need the bookkeeper or accountant because they really will understand what's been happening with some of the government grants and contracts, and did we just get off to a slow start, but we're going to pick up speed by the end of the year. So it's a collaborative effort to give your best guess of how it's going to end.
So in other words, this is not generated by QuickBooks or MIP or whatever.
No.
So because you know a lot of people do that. They like their statement of activities is generated and that's what they give to the board. This is taking data and putting it into an Excel spreadsheet. Even if you don't have this last column. Am I right?
Right. Yes. And one of the reasons, both MIP and QuickBooks, almost all accounting software now has an export feature and can export into Excel. And the reason for doing it, you'll notice this is a one-page statement. This is not 15 pages of detail. And for a lot of us with QuickBooks, we really have trouble getting a clean statement. Now, do I think that an executive director could manage their agency with just this little bit of information? No, obviously not. There's much more detail they need to see. But for a board member, we're kind of getting to the most important piece, which is if we have shortfalls in income, where are they? And if we have either shortfalls or over expenditures in expenses, what broad category are they in? Now, the other thing that's true about this particular report is we don't have any cost centers at all. This is the organization as a whole. And if we saw big problems here, we would have to dig down into more detailed information that we're going to look at in a minute. But in terms of sitting in a board meeting, trying to ask the oversight question, how are we doing? The balance sheet is the first thing to tell us what's our cash position, what's our net assets, and this projection of year end is the next thing. We're hitting some rocky roads, but how is it going to look by the end of the year? Really important information. And it is projected. People will say, oh, I'm going to get my bookkeeper to do that. And I say, I don't think so, because I don't think your bookkeeper has the information. It's usually the executive director and other people in the organization working together with the bookkeeper. And besides that, most people who become accountants don't like estimating very much. They don't like projecting. Okay, this is just a reminder slide that, there is a connection between the revenues and expenses and the balance sheet, right? That the way we're going to grow our net worth is we're going to have the revenues exceed the expenses and be net income. And that's going to make our opening net assets grow and be bigger at the end. Now this year, with all the difficulties we're having, I think a lot of us may see that when you subtract expenses from revenues, it's going to be a net loss. I think that's a real possibility. And if you add a net loss to the opening net assets, you'll have lower net assets. It's just reality. And, one of the questions that boards often ask when it's been hard times is, well, what's going to happen to us if we lose money? And the answer is, well, it kind of depends on whether you had built up reserves before. If you have built up reserves before, you'll be okay. If you hadn't, it's going to be tough. It's going to be a tough time. Okay, so now we get to the cost centers. We spent all morning talking about cost centers, and I didn't start with that for boards at all. That's because I actually think that a lot of the work in looking at financial information by cost center is work that the executive director and program people need to do, because they're right there. They're the ones that can impact the expenses, they can impact the revenue more directly. But I do think it's worthwhile for board members to have a chance to look at the revenues and expenses by cost center. Now, this is that program functional model like we talked about this morning. You could have it arrayed by awards, but awards aren't very interesting in this report because most awards are cost reimbursement. You don't get it unless you spend it, so they're always going to come out at zero. And the truth is, the only way you could get in trouble with that is if a program is actually going to cost more than the awards that you have funding it. And if you're just looking award by award, you're not going to see that. You're just going to see this endless array of, oh, look at that. Once again, revenues equaled expenses, because that's how the contract is structured. And you're going to have in that funding source model, you might have a column that's called unrestricted, and that's where we're going to see, well, gee, we aren't bringing in enough unrestricted to cover the gap between what it really costs and what these funding awards give us. Now, this is a lot like the budget that we looked at, divided into cost centers by function. We've got some allocated costs that we're spreading across. We're allocating administrative costs, and we're coming down to a bottom line of what is the difference between the income and the expenses. And here in the total column, well, that's the number we saw in the statement of activities, that in the unrestricted category, revenue exceeded expense by 10,000. But over here, going program by program, we can see what happened in the programs, and we can see if there are shortfalls. Like in this program Z, there was a shortfall of 18,000. How are we going to cover that? Well, fortunately, we have some fundraised income that we're going to be able to use to cover that. But the reason I like doing it this way for boards is I think it's helpful for board members to understand what is the impact of our different programs. Some of our programs we are able to break even on, but some of our programs, because of the funding agreements that support them, we're going to lose money on them because the funders aren't paying the full cost. So we need to understand, well, how much are we going to lose? Because at some point, the answer may be that's more than we can afford to lose. And we might have to get out of that program. We might have to decide to invest in more fundraising. We might have to see if we can renegotiate with that funder to use the dollars a little bit differently. But we have to, I want the board members to be aware of that problem. I'm on a board right now where we've experienced some pretty serious losses, and a first step in getting the board to grapple with the losses that the agency as a whole experienced was to get a functional expense layout like this so that we could talk more specifically about which of our programs were having those shortfalls and what did we want to do about it. So it's very helpful. But it isn't everything we need, because there's no way that anybody's eyes could handle budget comparisons to each of these programs and make this like a 10-column spread. People can't read that. So this is a good overview, but if we want to get down into it, well, how come Program Z is experiencing this loss? We're going to look at a report for Program Z that shows the actual and the budget and the projection for Program Z. And with our modern accounting software, whether it's QuickBooks or MIP, you're going to be able to do that, produce a report for each cost center. And since we budgeted by each cost center, we can compare the actual to the budget. So we were talking about what the board needs to see, and now I want to shift gears and talk about, well, what does management need to see? Because they've got a different job to do than the board does. And I think that you can't manage effectively without having a program by program comparison of actual to the program budget. And you might also need to have some reporting that looks at your grant income in two different ways. So let me show you what I mean. This report would be typical of if we had a funding award, say from the state, that followed our fiscal year perfectly. We go July through June, it goes July through June. So I can look at the year to date, what actually happened. I can look at the annual budget, that's what the contract says. How are we doing in terms of the actual as a percentage of the budget? You know, we might be 25% of the way through the year, but we might not be at 25%. We might have gotten a slow start and we're going to catch up later on in the year. So this projected year end is still really helpful to me. So if I'm a program manager or the executive director trying to think about how are we doing in this program, this is pretty good information. This is what I need. But some of our programs are funded by awards that don't line up with our fiscal year. And so having a report like this one, it's interesting, it's helpful in terms of, well, is our budget working out the way we thought it would? But it isn't everything we need. We also need this report, which says, you know, this award, it started before the beginning of our fiscal year. It has a budget that is not the same as our fiscal year budget. Remember, we had that chart where we broke out the portion of the grant award that was going to be used before our fiscal year, the portion we were going to use in our fiscal year, and the portion that would be left over for the next fiscal year. So I'm going to need a report on those grants that says not year to date, but grant to date compared to the grant budget, because of course when I'm reporting to the funder, what they want to know is, are you following the grant budget? They don't care about our fiscal year budget. So our software today, in the accounting software, can produce this information. We just have to ask for it, and we just have to know the difference between what is a grant-to-date comparison versus what is a fiscal year-to-date comparison. So that's something, that's one that I find people just kind of have to think about that, to take that in. But in terms of managers, you know, in larger organizations, we may have program managers that we've given budget responsibility, and we've said, you're managing the sexual assault program, you should understand all the different funding agreements that are supporting the sexual assault program. You should review the financial reports and the grant reports, and it's your responsibility to see that it's working. But in smaller organizations, usually it's the executive director that is going to have to be monitoring on each of these levels and understand what's going on. And it can work either way. You just need to be clear about who's doing what. And with that, I'm about to shift gears again, and for our last few minutes, talk about accounting report and reporting requirements, which I'm sure is something everybody has dreamed of spending a few minutes talking about. But I could take any questions if people wanted to ask about that financial information first. Did you see anything come in, Judy? We're just, people are on stun. Okay. That's why when this ends, you're going to want to take a few minutes to try answering the discussion questions and kind of thinking about it so it doesn't just like wash over you. Okay, but you know, it's entertaining to me that, you know, actually when I was taking accounting classes, way back, I had already been an executive director for a number of years, and don't ask me why, but I went back to school in accounting, and I remember my favorite professor saying to me, Kay, why do you keep going back to this nonprofit stuff? Why are you so interested in this? And I said, well, because I work in the nonprofit sector. This is really important to me. He said, that's ridiculous. You're a good student. No good student should be looking at nonprofits. What are you thinking? And, you know, that has changed so much. And now our day has come. And the Financial Accounting Standards Board, the body that makes the rules for U.S. accountants, they think we're important. It still stuns me. And so since we're so important now, they keep changing the rules for us. And so you could say, who cares? But actually, we all care, because if we're being audited or reviewed, the CPAs that we hire to come in and audit and review our financial information, their big question in their mind is, do these financial statements follow GAAP? And so if GAAP changes, they're going to, the playing field is shifting for us, and we have to conform to the new GAAP. Now, the FASB, the Financial Accounting Standards Board, that is a different group than the AICPA, which is the American Institute of CPAs, and they get to make up the auditing standards, and those are changing too, and that may be of even greater interest to smaller organizations, because what's happening with the auditing standards is that we have a huge new emphasis on auditor independence. And it's always been true that auditors are supposed to be independent of the organization that they are auditing. But I used to be an auditor, and I can tell you that I began every audit by preparing the formal financial statements for my client, because none of them had somebody working for them who could prepare a GAAP compliant statement and write the notes to financial statements. So I always did that. Well, that is absolutely forbidden now. And any auditor that got caught doing that would be in deep trouble. And so because the new thinking is, if you have prepared those statements and the notes, how can you possibly give an independent opinion of whether they were fairly prepared? Of course you think they're fairly prepared, you did it. So that has to stop. And that's been true for several years now, but now we've got a new layer of concern. And what happened when they started honing in on you can't prepare the statements was auditors started saying to their nonprofit clients, okay, if you don't have anybody here who can prepare a formal set of nonprofit statements, you're going to need to hire a third party to come in, take your information, put it into the proper form, write the notes, and then I'll come in and audit that. But now we have a new concern that, well, suppose they did that. Suppose they hired some local accountant who came in and did that. Does the nonprofit have enough knowledge of GAAP rules to be able to tell whether what that third-party accountant did actually does represent what happened in their organization? Or are they just going to say, well, okay, if you say it, then it's fine? And so they're now calling on auditors saying, you got to find somebody in that organization that is your client who has enough knowledge to have a judgment about whether these statements really do present what happened. So when I've been on the board of small nonprofits since all this has been going on, I often become that person as a board member, and I will talk to the auditor, and it will be clear that I understand what the statements mean, and I can have a discussion with them about the choices we made, and that satisfies them. But in my organizations, when I've done that, the staff really, they don't know enough about GAAP accounting to hold up their end in a conversation. And so, what the AICPA says to the auditors is get out of there. Don't do that kind of engagement because you're not going to be independent. So I don't know whether you've started hearing about this yet in smaller programs. I am seeing more times where the auditor is saying you need to hire somebody else to prepare the statements and then I'll audit them. And that's extra money, when you do that, and it doesn't always solve the problem. So I just mentioned that. Something else to worry about. But Judy knows I collect worries. So, and just think, compared to worrying about whether your staff are going to get the virus, I mean, that's kind of a pleasant worry to have instead of that. So again, this is all in, looking at this is a good break from real life. Okay, so there's something else happening in the accounting world, and this is from FASB, that we finally got clarification on the difference between contracts with customers and contributions. And this does matter for our organizations. So the question, what are we worried about, is this money that we just took in, is it a contribution? If it is a contribution, the next question I have to ask is, was it restricted or unrestricted? Now, this is a relevant question when I'm talking about a foundation grant, because they might have given me a grant just for general operating support, unrestricted. Or they might have given me a grant that has a restriction. This is only for the children's program. So I need to know that. Same thing with donor gifts. They might have given me an unrestricted gift. That's what I'm trying to get them to do. Or I might have foolishly sort of encouraged them to restrict their gift to a specific purpose. So if it's contribution, I need to figure out, is it restricted or unrestricted? But there's a whole other kind of thing that could result in someone or some entity giving our organization money, and that could be an exchange transaction. That is when someone is buying something from us. They're purchasing a service from us. And by definition, anytime we have that exchange or purchase of service, it is deemed to be unrestricted. And it's kind of it's strange when you have a lot of government money where, like, particularly in some counties, they will decide that for homeless services, they'll pay X dollars a night for each person housed. They're buying a service. They're not really giving a gift. They're buying a service. But they can put all kinds of restrictions on what you can do with that money, but it's not going to change the fact that it's an exchange transaction. And from the GAAP standpoint, it's going to get called unrestricted. So how can you tell the difference between a contribution and an exchange transaction? Well, it's going to come down. It doesn't matter what word is used in the agreement, because in agreements, particularly with governments, things are called contracts, they're called grants, they're called awards, they're called agreements. So don't go by the words. It's the substance. And so what you have to figure out is whether this is an actual exchange where they're paying you something and getting something in return. So it's kind of a tough concept, I have to say. I'm running a little bit slow. I'm thinking about how am I going to solve this. Okay, there's also been a big change in just thinking about government funding in general. And now the way we think about it is that government funding that is providing a benefit to the general public is not an exchange transaction. It is a contribution. Now, it seems contradictory because these agreements are often set up on that sort of per bed, per night basis, but we now have by definition that if it's government funding and it is to benefit the general public, not the government itself, then it is a contribution. And the only time we would see the government treated as a customer in an exchange transaction is that one where it's benefiting the government itself. Now, other big news, and I think we have time to cover this. We may run out of time on other things, but not on this. This is really relevant to foundation grants. So if you have been getting some multi-year foundation grants, which are becoming more common, in the past, you might have had a very confusing discussion with your auditor where they said, well, you know, this is a 3-year award from the Gates Foundation, but even though you aren't going to see any cash for the first 3 months of this, and even after you get the first payment, you're not going to see the total payment until out 3 years. We were told, no, when you got that award, call that restricted income and record the whole amount of the award. Now, this has had a big change in the last couple of years where the new rule says, well, that would be true that you would, you know, a 3-year award, let's say it's for $300,000, record the whole thing when you receive the award. That would be true unless the foundation put conditions on the award. And a condition is different from a restriction. So I could have an award that was restricted for my children's program over 3 years. It was restricted, but that wouldn't be a condition. So if it was just restricted, I still have to record the whole thing when I get the award. If it's a condition, I only record the income when we meet the condition. So what is a condition? It's where the donor, it's usually it could be foundation, requires the recipient to overcome a barrier. And if you fail to overcome the barrier, then the grantor is released from the obligation to provide the money and can demand the return of any funds that were already provided. So got to think about these barriers. What is a barrier? Well, it requires, you're the recipient, you have to perform in some way. Or it could refer to an event that is outside the control of the recipient. If there is a hurricane, if there is an epidemic, those could be conditions that make this a conditional award. There has to be limits to you, the recipient's discretion in how to conduct the activity. And we no longer worry about how likely is it that you can overcome the barrier. Yeah, Judy, I'll pause. You're looking at the time, I bet.
When you're done with this part, there's a question on audits.
Oh, okay. Well, I think maybe I have one slide that ties in here, and then let's go back to audits because I think it's probably more interesting and important. Okay, so why did I go on and on about is it conditional or is it restricted? It's because the timing of when you record a conditional grant is different. It's not recorded until the conditions are met.
Oh.
So one of the things that is happening now with large multi-year foundation grants is that many foundations are putting conditions into the agreements because they don't want to see the grantee forced to record the whole amount in the year they receive it, because they know that has created confusion. You know, if somebody has gotten a $300,000 grant that is for 3 years of the children's program and they're forced to record it in 1 year, it's going to look like they are very well funded when in fact they have to use that money in 3 years. So foundations are aware of how distorting that rule has been, and now that there's little exception about conditional gifts, you're starting to see more foundation agreements that have conditional pieces in them so that you only have to record the income 1 year at a time. All of which is to say, you really want to read your foundation agreements very carefully to be able to understand how they're going to get recorded. And with that, I think we should take this auditing question. So what is our auditing question?
So what's the ceiling, what's around having different kinds of audits? So if you have a small budget that's under $750,000, and then I'm going to add, how can you tell how much federal funds you have? Because that also triggers different kinds of audits.
Okay, so the issue around a federal funds audit is you are only required to have the special federal funds audit if in one fiscal year, your fiscal year, you expend $750,000 or more in money that is federal in origin. So to figure out, well, you know, if your total expenditures were under $750,000, you don't have to worry about this, right? Because there can't have been more than $750,000 in federal dollars. But if you have a larger budget, let's say you have a $1 million or $2 million budget, then you're going to have to go through all the different funding sources that you had for the year. Remember, as we talked about this morning, you're going to be tracking the expenditures on each of those funding sources. So you're going to look at the expenditures that were made in each of those funding sources during your fiscal year, and then you're going to review the funding agreement for each source, and you're going to figure out, is this federal money or not? Well, if it came directly from the federal government, it's federal. But if you're looking at money that might have come from the state or the county or another nonprofit, you're going to have to read the agreement carefully to see whether they are talking about this money, some of it is federal in origin. And if it is, then you're going to put it on your list and you're going to look, maybe this was a $100,000 award, but by the time you finished your fiscal year, you had only spent 80,000 of it. So it's 80,000 that you're going to add into your total of federal dollars expended during the year. And it's only when that total hits 750,000 that you have to have the audit. And this is something where it's very helpful if you know another organization that does similar work to yours and has had a federal funds audit, to ask them to see their audit and flip through the pages and look for the schedule of federal expenditures, which will be a long list of all the different federal sources they had. And it will be organized first by money that came directly from a federal agency, and then the next section will be from pass-through entities, and it'll say the state of Washington, DHSA. I always say that wrong, right? And you'll see the names of awards that you have. So if you see that on somebody else's list, it's federal for you too, and you're going to put it on your list. I think that, do you think that does it?
That's really smart. And then if you have a budget, if you don't meet that threshold, then what, and you don't need to do a single audit, or, you know, what would you recommend instead?
Okay, well, so you may not have that federal audit requirement, but you still have all the compliance requirements. So I would recommend that you comply with the requirements, because remember, you could still have a monitor come through from the funding source and look at all these same issues. And it's not like you're off free because you didn't cross that threshold. But another question would be, well, at what size does it really make sense that your organization should get its first audit or its first review of financial statements, which is a cheaper procedure? And, you know, this is something for your board to decide. As a board member, I am very uncomfortable once an organization crosses a $500,000 a year threshold in not having an audit or review. And I'm especially uncomfortable if I look at the sources of funds and it's a lot of governmental money or a lot of restricted foundation grants. I feel like I want that independent assurance that we have correctly accounted for that money, and that when I look at the financial statements, that really is what happened in the organization. But these are expensive, and so I know some people resist that kind of threshold. Do you have an opinion, Judy?
Nope. Nope.
No
but I
opinion.
think we're getting close to time. So
we are out of time, but let's take a quick look at what we're going to go over very fast and then wrap up. How's that sound?
Great.
I'll just point out that there's more definitions about restricted money, restricted contributions. This is just a reminder that we changed our language. We've now gone to without donor restrictions and with donor restrictions. And you should start seeing that on your financial statements. And here's an example of one. I've got the new language here: net assets without donor restrictions. And here we've got the board designated reserve fund. Oh, if only we had one. And these are the total net assets without donor restrictions. And then down here are those net assets with donor restrictions. That's like where we used to put the temporarily restricted. They total up to the total net assets. So you're going to be seeing that in your next audit. If you have, it should have been there in the last one, that we've stopped talking about temporarily restricted, and we're talking about with and without donor restrictions. And we've got two classes. And in our without donor restriction class, we've got the undesignated. We've got designated by the board, and then I like to break out the invested in fixed assets. And one more quick thing that I'm going to say, and this really is very challenging. I'm going to flip through the board designated. There's a new emphasis on liquidity. And, you know, the question that you asked earlier, will we have enough cash, or are we going to hit a payroll that we just don't have the cash? The auditors are very interested in this, and there is a new standard. And so you can expect, if you are an organization that has cash problems, you really are tight on cash, you're going to have an auditor asking you how you want to handle this new note that has to be put in the financial statements about your liquidity. And that really means just, are you going to have cash available when you need it? And they're going to show you that there is a way to examine your liquidity and that they have to take into account what you were saying, Judy, not just the total cash that you have, but is some of that cash actually restricted by donors or by contracts or by law so that it will not be available to you to meet your operating expenses? If there are that kind of restrictions, you're going to have to disclose them. And you might have some limitations imposed by your board. The board might have designated certain portions of your net assets for some future capital project that they want to do, you know, to put the new roof on the shelter. And until they remove that designation, those dollars can't be considered available for operations. So some of us are really having challenges in these discussions because the auditor is saying, I'm concerned that you can't show me how it is that you're going to have enough cash to meet your operating expenses. And if you can't come up with an explanation of how this is going to be possible, I'm going to have to put a comment in the audit that says they may not be able to continue operations. They may not be a going concern because they may not have the cash needed to meet their operating expenses. And you definitely don't want that in your audit report. And I included, I mean, I know for most people it's just like gobbledygook, but there are these there's this guidance for auditors on how to look at the liquidity. And I think it's worth thinking about ahead of time. And of course, one tool that really help you think about it, and it's just a basic management tool, is to start doing a rolling 12-month cash flow projection. Now, what is a cash flow projection? Well, it's a worksheet like this. It's an Excel spreadsheet where you're going month by month by month, and you start with the opening cash, and then you predict the cash that is going to come in during the month, and you predict what has to go out. And that might not be the same thing as expenses. These are bills you actually have to pay that month. And with what you had at the beginning and what's going to come in, that's what's available. This is what's going out, and this is how much will be left at the end of the month. And you just keep going and doing that, and you can see in this little 6-month projection, these folks are in trouble. They're not going to have the cash they need. Now, it's possible that if they had carried this out for 12 months, put another 6 months on there, we would see things getting better. And so 2 things. One, this is a really important management tool, right? That I need to be able to predict, will I have cash when I need it? But if you have extended it out to a 12-month forecast, it can be compelling to your auditor to show, yeah, it's kind of going to be tight in some periods, but we will have enough cash to operate for the year. And then the next question will be, but is any of that restricted? And your response is going to be, I've only shown the cash that we're going to be able to use in this projection. So I think it can be very helpful on that basis. And I know we're running over time, so what else is in the slides is just where you can find some of this information. And there we go to discussions in the same format as this morning. I hope you have someone to talk to. I guess you could talk to yourself, but it would be more interesting to talk with your accountant and other people from your program. And at the end of the discussion, you'll see in the questions that it really will be helpful if there are things you want follow-up or you'd like some online consultation to send that in to us so that we know that. So that's the plan for the rest of the afternoon. And just to remember what we were after here, we were realizing that, you know, all of us are kind of in this state of before, I think, just with what's going on. And hopefully you're closer to this after. I'm not sure you're there yet, but I look forward to hearing about that. So I'm going to stop. We're over time.
Okay, So we're going to wrap up now. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. And thank you very much, Kay. This was amazing. Thank you for blowing our minds. Okay.
Okay.
Be well, everyone. Stay strong, and we'll be in touch. Take